Everybody was there. Right. Quite welcome to this workshop. Is there any apologies? I think we're all here. Yes. Yeah, it's good. Just want to welcome Stuart. It's good to see you. But are you going to lead this discussion? We're all good, and the team, of course. The floor is yours.
Kia ora koutou. Tēnā koe. Well, we're finally here. It's been a long journey. And so we're absolutely delighted to workshop with you today on 3 aspects of proposed legislation and proposed reform, namely the Natural Environment and Planning Bill, the draft submission on emergency management reform, and draft submission on the government's rates capping proposal. Principally the team, Marcus and Shana, who will be familiar with you all from last year, will be leading you through this workshop. In terms of process from here, our intention is, following your discussions and directions, we'll be synthesising that into the various submissions that we'll be making to the government, which we will then be seeking again further consideration for all and adoption or endorsement, at the council meeting, the next one on the 9th, in submitting to government. So I'll hand over to Marcus.
Thanks, Heidi. So just in terms of the timeframe, so the emergency management reform submission is due on the 3rd, which is Tuesday next week, and the rates capping proposal, which is not actually a bill, it's more of a proposal at this stage, it's due on Wednesday next week. So we look to circulate drafts of those 2 pieces of work either tomorrow afternoon or early Friday, and then look to get them in feedback by Monday, and then compile that and then into the system. So thanks very much. So first we'll work through the new Replacement Resource Management Act bill. So there's eight key areas that we're looking to put submissions on. That's going to be the primary focus that we see. We could spend probably 5 times as much energy and go through clause by clause, but we figure that the timeframes given and the ability to affect change, we're better off keeping the submission points pretty high level and focusing on some of the big structural elements and some of the key components, just to make sure that our work is effective, and we're trying to identify any issues that pop up so that we get our feedback in the right space. So in terms of a bit of a broader context, it's been a pretty big 18 months or 2 years, I guess, of regulatory reform. So a couple of the things we've seen come through already. We've had fast-track approvals, regulatory standards, local water's done well. We're also currently looking at rates capping, climate change adaptation, reform of regional council structures, and resource management reform. So when we've been looking at, I guess, the different components, it's difficult to understand how they all fit together and how the one change, when one thing's going on, there's one thing changing at once. It's very easy to contextualise that with a known environment of how the structure works, how we can get rates done, how we engage with mana whenua, how the different things operate within the system. But as everything is changing all at once, it's very difficult to try and understand the systems and the processes and some of the mechanisms that we will have and the tools that we can use to be next to be compliant and operationalise the requirements of the different pieces. So it's good to understand that. I guess the feedback today is, we're trying to link the different pieces together so you can get a broader understanding of the consequential impacts of certain aspects, even though there's, we've got to submit on each one in its own case. there are wider implications from one that flows on to the next. Like changing mandates, how that is going to be funded, who's making the decisions. But effectively, in summary, there's changes to what we're doing, how we're doing it, who's doing it from a local government perspective, who's making decisions on it, and how we're actually paying for it. So there's significant change across a number of elements that are also accumulating in the next few months and effectively over the next 10 months till election time.
I should also note that we have been working quite across as well as within Murihiku Southland, so across not just the regional government sector, but the local government sector broadly, and others in their draft submissions which have been circulated have referred to, and it's also our intention to refer to those connections to the various pieces of reform, if this, then that type submission points. So we're acknowledging that these pieces actually are all interconnected and we should speak about them within the context of giving one proposal or one bill to those interconnectedness with a view to ensure that we deliver a Southland voice and continue to try and ensure that there is a system and framework that works for Southlanders and for Southland and honours our treaty-based partnership with Maitaki community.
And just want to mention too that keen for questions, comments as we go through. I don't want to save up all the juicy bits for the end. So if there's anything that we're talking about through the process, keen for any sort of feedback or as we go through, just so we can capture those and make sure that those elements and those sentiments are reflected in the submission, and then we circulate that with you. So effectively, the way this PowerPoint set up is basically looking at what's changing, the sector view, and then our views on what we think about how it's going. So I'll sort of present it in that sort of tone. What's happening? What's changing? What are the sector saying about it? And then where do we want to land from our submission? So yeah, keen for any thoughts as we roll through. So
there's one thing that's not quite covered that would be good as a discussion at the end. So Environment Southland has a long tradition of an approach in these submissions. Of course, many of you here were in the previous council and of taking a broadly positive tone and approach with pointing out risks and consequences of those risks, but being very solutions focused within, thinking about what works for Southland and Southlanders. So it would be good to, as we kind of go through each of these and you discuss them and say, yes, that's right, or no, we want to change it this way. We think it's best to continue that particular approach and tone. We have a long, I'm told, and very proud tradition of being quite impactful with central government. And so we think that this time around that approach will continue to bear fruit for us. So just something to think about.
So in terms of the replacement resource management legislation, so effectively the existing resource management is proposed to be repealed. And there's two proposed new acts to replace it. They're currently in bill status, out for submissions. Submissions close on the 20th of February. So the planning bill lays out the framework for how land can be used and developed, and then the natural environmental bill focuses on managing use of natural resources and protecting the environment. So it's somewhat urban TA focused, and then the environmental bill is more regional council focused in terms of current functions, how they work. And then in addition to that, there's a big bunch of national instruments that direct the process for developing the certain elements within the bills.
Can I just make a point, Hayley's comment then? I just want, is everybody comfortable with it? I'm just asking. Like,
I'm not. On this occasion, and it's a wonderful legacy,
So it's like
wonderful
things
legacy for the organisation as councillors who've got a ticking time bomb on how much their life expectancy is as a council. It's a wonderful legacy to say, yeah, it was great to have them while they existed, but it was a really nice neutral position they adopted before we killed them off and democracy suffered it like years as a result. So
I would argue, we wanted to check in with you.
I would argue at this occasion we might want to move slightly to the more active engagement rather than neutral engagement on these issues, because I see a huge range of issues in terms of democratic hollowing out as a result of these changes.
Yes, that's what I thought. So that's why I was asking the question. That's why I said, I don't know whether it's time for us to be sitting here and going, oh, this is just wonderful. Because the environment of our existence and everything's been sort of challenged. And so it was there for that start of it, Lyndall, and then.
Yes, also me, but well aware that providing constructive solutions is actually really valuable, but that doesn't mean we have to be soft in our language or wishy-washy or whatever. We can still be very forceful and very firm about our stance, notwithstanding Councillor Morrison's points around actually, let's go down fighting if we're going down.
Well, thanks, it's just to really question Jeremy Bill and support Lyndall. I recall a quote by Martin Luther King who said that you can't fight darkness with darkness. You have to fight it with light. So I think we do have to be positive, but be fair as well.
If I may, Mr. Chair, and because it's up there staring me in the face, national instruments. Mindful as I am that the coastal policy statement is exceedingly aged and that we were looking forward to making some changes to that, this is going to delay this by quite a significant period, but our coastal environment is under huge pressure. If you could, in your wisdom, find a way of expressing your concerns to those who think this is a really good idea, when you think about the amount of New Zealand's coast that this council is responsible for, it is really moot that you argue quite forcibly about the delays that this is going to mean, because the planning process in itself, irrespective of what they do about regional councils, takes a long time to fully work through. If we can't work on it now, even allowing for the fact that there may be some policy direction changes, but looking at the challenges that are in front of us, I think that that is very detrimental. And if you're talking about an environmental instrument, I don't think that where the ocean is concerned that we have got the time to spare. So just if I may say that from somebody who worked on the first coastal plan, and know just how difficult that was, I think we cannot afford to delay anymore, and this will delay it. I'm concerned.
So is that a reasonable indication that maybe we need to tweak our approach? That's what I'm getting a feeling. Is everybody comfortable with a wee bit of that?
Yes, thank you. That's actually very helpful. And thank you very much, Evelyn. We do make a commentary on timeframes to implementation, so that's an important point we will also highlight. Thank you.
All good.
Just a question around implementation and planning that we're seeing the goals be shifted on discharge to sea and such like. How does that then layer on what we're just discussing now? Because
yeah, through you, Chair, effectively that's part of that process that we need to work through, and particularly I'll probably talk about a little bit more in the limits part of the conversation. So one of the requirements is that regional councils set limits, but there's already been a carve out for municipal wastewater disposal. Then the limits are somewhat more difficult, and the impact of those limits fall at different places on the community. So whether that's industry or rural sector, to pick up some of those targets, if we're aiming for the state of Aurora, then that's great, that's aspirational, it's a good place to be in, and that's where we should be heading. But if there's carve-outs for municipal systems, then we need to consider how that lands on the ground, and ultimately how that sort of shakes out of the process, and how much ability localism is going to have in determining those limits, and where the government sort of steps in and adjust the discretion effectively of council's ability in that space.
Hollington over on that one.
And I guess in terms of the national instruments, we've seen some of the new national policy statements, but there's still a number of instruments that will detail more specifically how the system, or how the processes behind the system development will work down the track. And I guess the bills provide some framework, but they don't go down into a level of detail that is really beneficial at this point. There's still a lot that is unknown with how the processes and the systems are going to work to actually understand really accurately how long and how quick it's going to take and how much money it's going to cost to get through those processes and where the litigation impacts are. And we know through the current Schedule 1 process with the Water and Land Plan, and it's been a long, truncated process for identifying the problems and the science and coming up with a solution, getting it through to actual decision. We want to make sure that the local planning approaches are a lot quicker through that process too. So there's not years bound up and spending hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to negotiate and litigate to a position where the rules land in the right spot. So how do we make sure that the impact of those regulations can actually start bearing fruit sooner?
Yeah, look, that's what I took when I went through some of those documents. It's like a jigsaw puzzle that hasn't got all the pieces yet. And we need to say that when you're commenting, that you're not seemingly interpreting something that you've got no evidence for. Surely that's part of it, isn't it, really, as far as I can see, because this is a short time frame to give feedback on something that is still evolving, really.
Yeah, and short timeframes for implementation, like when you look at the timeframe for spatial planning and then the regulatory regional plan that comes after it, they're very tight and very fast. And it's almost the analogy of the three-legged stool. It's either fast, it's cheap, or it's good, and you can only really get two of those components. You never really get the third. So it's either fast and cheap, but not necessarily good. So we need to figure out exactly how the implementation of this new system with spatial planning and then regulatory planning processes are all going to fit together with getting a quality outcome.
But the bit about doing away with 100 plans down to 17, the bit about having one plan for Southland instead of regional policy statements, and that could be the bit that we sort of applaud, is that we get a better focus on what's happening in the province, but we're unsure about how that's all going to happen. So there is, I think there is room to have some positive feeling about it, because the ratepayers want that, and we want more of our ratepayer dollars surely going to the activity, and that makes it more affordable. So, yeah.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, kia ora, David. I agree with you. There's those blank pieces of the jigsaw. So I'm suggesting there's the opportunity here that we don't wait for someone else to paint that picture on that piece of jigsaw, but an opportunity for us to say what we think that picture on that piece of jigsaw should be looking like and how it would all come together. I just think it could be opportunity, just trying to be on the positive focus as an opportunity for us to go, well, this was a missing link, and this is what we think it should be looking like. So,
cool. So I guess draft recommendations, effectively what our initial thinking is from a staff perspective, and totally want to hear your views on it, is we don't divide the environmental legislation to effects in separate statutory subsets as it leads to inefficiencies. If retained the two systems, ensure the definitions are sufficiently broad and integrated to reflect real-world environmental interactions, and ensure there is no regulatory gaps where the effects are excluded from the consideration under both bills. So trying to make sure that they're really well fit together, so there's no sort of gaps that things fall out through the process.
So our starting point there in quite simplistic terms is we think it should be one piece of legislation, because then it's truly integrated. The environment cannot be separated out from everything else that we're trying to achieve in Southland or Southlanders. However, if you wish to proceed with two pieces of legislation, then it has to be grounded in the real world, around the decisions that people make every day about how they wish to occupy, use, inhabit places. And so we need to ensure then that there are no overlaps, no contradictions, no gaps. Is essentially what that means.
So it's part of that around, like you did mention about the carve out for wastewater. That water quality should be water quality wherever it is. Surely that's a bit of a principle rather than having, an MMP look at it.
Through you, Chair, that's exactly right.
In addition to that, I guess been a bit of a transition from the previous system of the Resource Management Act, with domain approaches to things like the coastal environment, water quality, whereas some of the national direction that's come out in the last 2 years has been offshore electricity generation. There's been a specific carve out for that, and then there's infrastructure carve out for that. It's been very much more activity based rather than topic based. So it's very difficult to get integrated management when you've got a carve out for this and a piece of national direction for that, and trying to string those different pieces together. So if 3 waters is important for abstraction or discharge, how do you manage that against other activities in terms of the state of everything sort of comes back to water and effects on the land, impact the water and effects the air, impact the water, it all fits together. So trying to understand all those linkages from the different activities in their own right to a domain is pretty important, and it's a different philosophical shift with how the legislative drafting has been between the old system and the RMA to the new system, which is more activity based and getting exemptions for certain activities to enable fast tracking or other elements.
An observation, we use the term carve out. It's an interesting term because what it's suggesting is that is set aside, that is no longer in our domain to make a decision on. It's fixed, it's established for us. What this system is proposing with national policy standards and national policy statements and national standards is essentially the entire system will be fixed for us. We won't have discretion in a lot of areas around what's expected done in that way. I guess it seems to me there is a centralisation, a significant philosophical centralisation of decision making at the expense of a local or regional discretion. So essentially, could that be interpreted as a pretty significant, chunky carve out, which leaves very limited decision making at a regional, local level?
Through you, Chair. A bit of a mixed bag, but I'd say that you are 80% correct in that assessment. So, for example, when it comes to the regional spatial plan, when you're getting down into the more detail of things, there will be national standards for zones. And so you'll have seen headlines and press releases from the government around we're taking 1,300 zones and we're going to put it into, a small number, and then it'll be yourselves as decision makers to sort of take the paint box, and you've got, the colours, and those are the colours, and it is up to you to paint those colours depending on what the science says and the local context and that type of thing. And so it's about things that are more about spatial extent of this colour or this zone. So yourselves with territorial authorities, obviously, and the like. And so we do have a slide that then talks about how limits will be set. So there will be some that will be set, particularly the human health related ones, nationally. But then there will be the ones that are related to environmental health will be set regionally. That's correct. And so you're kind of given a limited palette of colours, much more so than you had under the old system.
Perhaps a connection to that. Can I ask about the way that they describe the environmental limits? Because in the past we've enjoyed the environmental limits is don't let it fall below this limit. Whereas one possibility, and I'm not sure if it's explicit in what's proposed, is you are not to go beyond this limit in terms of a ceiling or a floor. And is that explicit in what's proposed as to which of those two systems they're imagining will support the system? Because if it's a ceiling, then you cannot impose environmental limits that exceed the set of expectations. That further constrains how we can make gains for the environment in the region.
That point is there's not enough clarity in the information that's come out at this stage to really answer that question.
So
Point around paint by numbers, square box, X amount. But you're additional to that, you've got the carve out, so you've got a percentage of that box that's already shifted. And then there's a percentage, the percentage that's left has to be divided by those that's left. That would be a very straightforward way of describing it.
Through you, Chair, it's not quite like that. I think that's sort of where the analogy, which I possibly not helpfully proffered, breaks down, in that carve-outs are certain ways of considering things, and it's like its own mini framework, so it's constraining the things you can consider within that. And so, you know, it's like Fast Track Approvals Act compared to the RMA. It's a more narrow framing for considerations for big chunky things often, or complex things. So you don't quite have the breadth. The decision makers don't have the breadth that they would have under the Resource Management Act, that they would under the Fast Track Approvals Act. So it's more that for certain things that have specific national direction, there'll be a narrower framework of considerations, because there is an objective there from the government to encourage things or discourage things. So it's much more aligned to quite a specific objective they want, something they've offered quite specific national direction on, as opposed to a broader set of considerations under the old framework, Resource Management Act, and then under this framework, which is slightly more constrained. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, but I don't think it hasn't actually shifted the conversation too far from where I was. Because you've still got a framework that allocates a certain amount of resource here that actually is constraining the rest of the community. The community doesn't get any input into what that looks like.
John?
Yes, probably just to Phil's point, Ricky, the legislation being put forward around compensation at local level for impact on business might be one way that that ceiling is met. But on that other slide that was just up, where it talked about 30-year plan, spatial planning, and then it talked about the minister's influence at a certain role. How does that work? And is that minister's influence at the time of change of government, or does local government stay in a cycle opposite to central government? Because you might as well throw the top one away if they stay aligned down the bottom, because we're just keeping the yin-yang of whatever minister's in. So I'm very nervous how all of this is down to several individuals in Wellington. It's just going to be a whole lot of stuff for no change.
Yeah, and I guess that talks to the point about Councillor Morrison was talking about centralisation of minister making some of these big decisions. It's almost like not necessarily I'm going to say it, but not necessarily meant as almost a right of veto at a minister level to say you've been through this community process, you've got to this sort of position. It doesn't necessarily align with our aspirations, and therefore it needs to look like this rather than that. So there is that level of control at that ministerial level towards the end of the process.
And in addition, and in fairness to the government, what they are trying to do in part, I mean, I'm a huge fan of regional spatial planning. It just makes sense. It provides our communities certainty, and they can see on a plan their aspirations over a longer period of time. What the government has, as part of this, is a requirement for the how we stitch them together, not what they say necessarily, although there's national direction on that, so that this can aggregate up into in effect, a singular plan for the country, which allows the government then to make prioritisation choices around funding. And this is where it connects into the National Infrastructure Plan as well. And so there is a strong driver here for these that tracks up, but equally, to your point, Councillor Pemberton, that brings risk in terms of where Southland sits in the pecking order of funding decisions around big things that help us do the things we want to do for Southland. And so there's good things and bad things. It is challenging for that decision-making point, that influence and control. If we spend a lot of time and set expectations with our communities about what we think this vision for 30 years looks like in terms of how it's going to roll out, how we're going to achieve those outcomes. If then it is cut across.
The farm plans, please, might lay it out for everybody to understand.
And similar to that point too, like if we're operating in a more fiscally constrained environment moving forward with rates capping, then how do we operationalise or activate the spatial planning components? If we identify these are the things that we want over a 30-year horizon, whether in water quality or biodiversity or whatever the particular elements are, if we haven't got the ability to rate or get access to funds to invest or activate or use non-regulatory methods, it becomes difficult to actually operationalise and get our way to the destination we're aiming for.
I was just going to make a comment myself. I'm sitting there trying to, we're writing submissions on something that we typically don't know where the outcomes are. And I was trying to say, well, it's a bit like, oh, here, you can buy this car. Here's a picture of it, not even colour on it. But that's what you've got. You haven't got the detail of how it's going to ride, is it functional? Is it? And you actually say, well, we can't give you that. And then you're trying to get an end game almost from this, what they're telling you. And you go, we're in the ground, looking at the ground level of what we're trying to do environmentally. But we haven't got that detail. And I'm very wary of putting something out, oh yes, we agree to that. We think it might mean that, but this is what the central government means. So it's quite it's a difficult discussion to have. It'd be great to have some detail on what their standards are, what it means for our region. And how it will reflect into the future. But yeah, it's just, and then we're trying to work out what's the words we use to put our position effectively, not knowing what the outcomes are, sort of thing. So, Roger and then Aaron. Sorry.
One aspect of the proposals that requires limits to be put in place, as I understood, includes some sort of prescribed process for doing it. So you can set the limits in your region using our methodology. And I'm wondering if we've had any early line of sight as to what those methods look like and how they compare to the body of work that's being developed in the region to date.
No visibility over the moment.
That was the answer, I just wanted to.
I've been trying to get ahead of what the drivers are that the government's wanting to do with this. And we can understand that we can make a contribution to help them achieve that. But at the moment, I'm sort of shadow boxing in my brain, what's left of it, just actually how we can land in a place that's going to help us and help them get there. And I think Prime Minister of Canada this week made a statement that you're not at the table, you're on the menu.
Yeah.
And we need to be at the table, but we need to understand what the objectives the government are driving at. I'm not sure whether you can help with that, but I can understand why you're shaking. But somehow or other, we've got to get a better understanding of what their expectations are in a system to get there in a way that benefits all parties.
Through you, Chair, it is principally our plan for how we are going to encourage, promote, manage regional growth over that 30-year period, whilst taking that long-term 30-year plus view that's integrated across the region, across a number of things, particularly land use, infrastructure, the environment. But at its core, it's about regional growth, economic growth.
Okay, we'll carry on into the unknown.
I'll just put through this slide pretty quick. So effectively, yeah, you've got the nail on the head. 30-year horizon for spatial planning. Seems to be more infrastructure and development, urban focus for the spatial planning, as opposed to more sort of catchment management, improving water quality. But I guess the regional sector is saying, hey, look, we want it to be more broad than just an urban exercise of identifying future growth. So effectively, local authorities establish a regional spatial planning committee, and that carries a central role throughout the process of the spatial plan. And then there's an independent hearings panel which would hear the submissions and then make recommendations that would go back to home base of the councils to ratify a decision and potentially only appeal rights if you divert away from the recommendations of the independent hearing panel. And then, as sort of previously just talked about, the minister's got multiple levers to influence different parts of that process as it ticks through. So in terms of the Kahika perspective, they want a bit more clarity on roles and governance of the regional spatial planning committees, strengthen process and steps for committees to develop with flexibility for regional differences. So not just basically ticking off a menu box, recognising that there's regional differences, and then stronger engagement with communities in tangata whenua. Mandatory and optional matters. They want to limit the mandatory components to key specific issues, but they want more flexibility for regional priorities. So making sure there's that localism in that process, and ensure that climate adaptation and natural hazards are those key parts. And then constraints mapping, standardised requirements for mapping environment and development constraints, extending beyond the urban areas, so more broad. So we're thinking of landing our draft recommendations. So strengthen public engagement processes to reflect the foundational role of regional spatial plans in shaping out the regional system. Embed meaningful iwi involvement at all stages of spatial planning and decision making. Expand the scope of regional spatial plans to be more effectively manage environmental resources in rural areas. Reduce the extent of ministerial discretion to support local decision making, and clarify dispute resolution processes to complement that consensus-based decision. So, keen for any thoughts or views around those key parts.
Yeah, just first thought is that the environmental resources that need to be managed are not just in rural areas. Appreciate that we want to emphasise that it's a region-wide spatial plan and it's not just about urban growth. But there are natural resources within the urban confines as well. So I would question whether rural areas is necessary in that statement.
I'm sort of mindful that the caveat for offshore wind farms has been mentioned already way back, but looking at the spatial planning and looking at a regional awareness of the risks that any offshore wind farm is going to face in this area, how much can you take that into consideration when you're doing the spatial planning to say that there are some areas which common sense says that we're just not going to be encouraging people to even apply, because it's not just, oh, it looks like it's not close to a piece of land or whatever, but we are really mindful that our fishers have to traverse through that area, that coastal shipping traverses through those areas, all those sorts of things, which may not cross the minds of people in Wellington, but certainly cross our minds. Are we going to be able to influence that under this spatial planning? Because that's something that's not quite clear to me, where the carve-outs can be connected on by what is regionally inappropriate or appropriate.
Through you, Chair, it is anticipated that we undertake marine spatial planning. However, I don't know, and maybe my colleagues know better than me, the detail yet about whether we are able to actually say this area is just for the fishes and birds, this area is for these things, you know, like we would undertake more traditional land use planning.
Yeah.
I believe reading it might allow for that, but we need more detail. Would you agree?
Correct, that would be my assumption too, but I guess it's worth noting too that the Fast Track Act exists and it may still exist in the future too, so there's a carve-out process that would, I guess, have little consideration or only cursory consideration to regional spatial plan if it's a project of national significance.
So going back to the conversation that we had earlier about limit setting, are we prescribed from putting those things in your spatial plan just because there is a carve-out, or is it sensible of us to consider that so that anybody else knows that it's not really just a case of going through the fast track, that the commissioners will look at local based recommendations and knowledge I don't know where it's going to fall, but I just felt the need to ask that question because we have had a couple of applications that have not met the criteria.
A few, Morris, Phil, David, Alistair.
Right, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Well, following on what Evelyn says about local input, the new system is very scary, actually. I'm just reading from the function, from the start of the introduction of the bill as it stands at the moment. The minister's responsibilities are list this long, and it says that central government has a broader and more active role in shaping and overseeing the new system, and then it lists all the sorts of things that the minister can do and basically override everything that we think is important. So I'm looking at the 1, 2, 3, 4th line there that you've got, and I wonder if we could strengthen that a bit, where it says reduce extent of ministerial, if that could be changed maybe to control. Discretion is a very polite word, but maybe that's, to allow setting minimum standards. The minister, the central government, can set minimum standards, but if the regional council wants to set higher standards than that, Phil's doing that before, we should be able to do that, if that's what the local community wants. I think that's personally, I think that's a really important part of the overall philosophy of the new bill. So we're very much top down, we all know that. Very limited opportunity for us to set standards or rules that our community wants.
Question on the first bullet point, strengthening public engagement processes. Does that suggest more time is needed for the first iteration? And given that I understand it's pretty ambitious timelines for the first delivery, which may curtail or constrain our public engagement opportunities.
Correct, and it's not exactly clear exactly what evidential information you need in the spatial planning process either. So if you wanted to set limits, and I think that's part of the process, that we have limits allocated and it flows through the spatial planning process, but it's such a quick, tight process that it's difficult to know exactly what information we need to inform the limits, to then engage on the limits and have a meaningful conversation on the limits and work out the differences of perspective and the science and the different arguments, to then get it through by notification timeframe, which I think is about midway through 2027. I think quarter 3.
And I guess the reason I ask that is because of the connection to other proposed reforms, that's about the time that we should be knocking off councils who have got a place-based environmental governance understanding hard one over a number of years and giving it to someone else who doesn't have that experience. So that seems to me to carry a huge amount of risk to those two line up together if you're in that amount over a timeline.
And through you, Chair, if I may add, we also are very concerned that the first generation regional spatial plans will set an expectation around resource use and investment by local government, investment by central government, and then in a more fulsome second generation regional spatial plan, decision makers may then go, oh, this is not, well, actually the evidence doesn't bear this direction out. And so we may be in a position where we're having very awkward conversations with communities and businesses about dialing back activity development use. And that, because people have now got an expectation, businesses have invested on the basis of that first generation spatial plan. And so that is not, I'd love to be here doing that second generation spatial plan with you all. But that's not a conversation you want to have with businesses who make medium to long-term investment decisions off the back of
You're saying try and get it right as much as possible the first time around.
Getting it right as much, but we question whether there is time to get it right the first time. Although acknowledging the point that Evelyn said around that the coastal environment can't wait.
Okay, David and then Al.
Yeah, there is another conversation in here that is, firstly, I guess it's really hard to put a blanket over the whole country to do with the environment because Taranaki's got much shorter catchments than we have, and so you end up with something that doesn't fit for anybody. There has been a very difficult discussion, though, happening in our main area, so our egg sector fill. And the regional forum delivered us up a model that would see most people have to give up with the sort of limits. And we've also had that in Canterbury with the zone committees, and we've had years of litigation and bits and pieces. So it's interesting that economic has been elevated a little, because it's one thing to have an environment and elevated to the point where we all have to leave just seems ridiculous. So that's sort of the elephant in the room, I believe, on this stuff. In saying that, I think we can work our way through this locally, but it's not an easy discussion. So, I think that's probably what spawned some of this. That we've been at loggerheads for years over how to do this stuff. So we need to have that in there somewhere, that we want to have that discussion ourselves, and that you can't have a national standard over the whole country, because each of the regions, the catchments are so different. But it's not an easy discussion to have, because on the one hand, people's businesses could be totally destroyed, and at the end of the day, what's the point if we can't make a living out of stuff? So we do have an effect. I think that has to be reflected somewhere in there. It's a difficulty going forward. That's the reason. And the other thing with some of the stuff around, the rollover of consents, making it easier, seems logical. Nothing's changing at all, and so that helps give a bit of certainty. But I agree to your point. If it seems like you can go and do a whole lot of stuff and then you come back and go, well, we're going to change all that, it's no good for you. So we need a big discussion down here about this. We need to own up that it's been difficult.
I would say this government's really focused on economics rather than most things. That's where we still need the balance. And I think a few consents do certainly need to be reviewed occasionally.
Yep.
To keep everyone honest too. So, Alistair.
I think following on from Morris and probably Eric, the situation is we've got the indication of what the government wants. They want central control. So how do we then put submissions up? Do we go and say and make really good positions or good submissions on the basis that it needs to be regionally controlled, and knowing that the highest likelihood is that they're going to do it from central? Or do we just roll over and kick in the air and say, yes, sir, no, sir, we will do exactly what you want? That is not the Southland Psycho. So, and then they've told us, so what do we do? Marcus, you're the man.
Kind of a bigger team.
But that's the guts of it, what the indications they've given us.
You have to give them an alternative solution.
Yeah, well, fine, yeah. I wasn't going to say. We're going to take Riverton out.
Right. Lyndall.
No, we've got to put up really sound proposals that we get it back to being regionally controlled and not controlled by the central government.
Just in regards to that, they've obviously put a peg in the sand there. They're telling us what they think of us.
Yeah.
Which they said we don't
We're
want
no
to
good.
hear.
We're
no
gone.
good. So we've got to make sure our submission is really grunty, say that they need to reflect on some of their decisions. This is their opportunity to do it. But look, I've got Lyndall, John, and then Eric.
Yeah, thanks, Chairman. In response to the discussions about reducing ministerial intervention, two things, I guess. Firstly, if the ministerial interventions are reduced, it allows for greater transfer of the process should there be a central government change. So that is one thing, in my view anyway, simplistic view, that might be helpful to Councillor Morrison's point earlier about central government changing regularly. And now I've forgotten the other thing. We haven't talked about it much, but the limits and the cumulative effects. There's a really nasty little fish hook in the limit setting about I can't really know the existing environment. If it's already degraded, then it doesn't matter. You can put stuff in it. That bit really concerns me, and I know it's not necessarily this particular part of the conversation, but it sprang to mind, so I thought I'd better say it before I forgot. Thanks.
Keep moving.
Yeah, and good point there, Lyndall. To the rollover of consents, a number of people have gone through reconsenting or new consents and have taken responsibility for the community around the cumulative effects. And Canterbury is a classic example of those 18 or 20-year conversions. They are coming in with much lower losses than the current neighbour who's now got a 3-year rollover. So I've gone through the process myself, spent a good chunk of cash. Do we get 3 years added onto our consent that we had to fight hammer and tong for just to get a 10-year consent? So, it's consistency for an investment. But, and look, I don't expect an answer now, but at what point do you think you could come to us with examples of how would the Waituna process be done? How would a normal consent be done? The fact is we're still going to deal with consent. But I think we don't understand how the heck are they going to be processed in the future. That's my biggest worry. There's a certainty around the businesses that have consents. How can they have a surety that it will be treated in a way that takes in all of what we're talking about?
Yeah, and I guess it's what springs to mind is allocation of resource and how do we divvy up resource within the limit that's available and who gets what portion of it and how do we manage that to make sure that it's not a market-based highest bidder wins on resource and make sure there's a fair suck of the salad that everybody in the catchment that we're making sure that there's enough for human health and ecosystems and industry and people and all of the elements. How do you get all those aspects?
Their language is tenders and bidding. So what does that say?
The language is what, sorry, John?
Their language is a bidding process.
Yeah.
Let's keep moving. Parent input and then we'll really start.
Well, the government has always had control over what any local authority does, and if it deems it to be not performing properly, it can put a commissioner in there and do it, and it has done that on a number of occasions. But I think there's just too many unanswered questions about that line up there, and one of the things that hasn't been mentioned is the fact the government wants to cap rates. And is this a driver for saying, well, you're not going to do that because you're going to exceed your cap limit and what's there? And, we're a very unique regional council in terms of our floodable rivers and our coastline and our population and everything else. Somehow or other, we need to be able to say, you don't have a match for us anyway. How are you going to have an influence over actually what we do?
Yeah, no, I'm listening to it all, and it is still like we are all a little bit in the dark, and there's a lot of stuff that is unanswered, and it's possibly because the government still haven't formulated their defines what any. There must be something there, substance. But if we can go back to the government and say, look, we're here, we're doing it, we can help if you let us. Just give us the tools, give us the provocation. Sure, it may not be the way we want it to go ahead. There needs to be some change, but we're here. We're ready to go. We're ready to help. And that gives you that positive spin. Because basically at the moment, what we're getting is not enough. The information we're getting is leading us to this, guesswork. But if we can say, hey, we're here, we're ready to go, we know what we're doing, just give us the guidelines and the rules and everything else.
You got plenty of feedback there.
Perfect, sounds good. I'll move on to environmental limits. I'll look through the maybe 3 slides and then pause for some questions. Limits, foundational bottom lines are intended to address cumulative effects for human activities. Minister will set human health limits through national standards, and the regional councils will set ecosystem health limits in actual environmental plans. So methodologies for setting those will be provided in the national standards in another 6 months or so. And then effectively definition of management units and attributes, and where breaches of limits occur, regional councils will lead the resolution process through using action plans. So we support subject to refinements is our general sort of thinking. So to Udo Kahika, indicating that providing national consistency but allow for spatial flexibility for local adaptation, staged approach and setting limits to focus first where environmental pressures are greatest, flexible implementation starting with well understood attributes and expanding over time. For example, reducing sediments and waterways is particularly challenging. Enable use of a range of management tools, regulatory, non-regulatory, to achieve environmental limits efficiently, and simplify and centralise reporting and reviewing requirements to allow staged and staggered reporting. So our draft recommendations are to highlight the importance of developing effective national standards for environmental limit setting methodologies based on robust evidence, closely collaborate with regional councils in developing the relevant national standards. Limits should be set ahead of spatial planning being developed, and we've talked about that a little bit already. Enable regional councils to use both regulatory and non-regulatory methods in all cases, including when a limit has not been reached yet. Adequately address implications of wastewater standards, which we've talked about, and then ensure national standards for regulating market-based resource allocation sufficiently address equity concerns. So equity as opposed to equality. So try to make sure that everybody gets a fair go. So yeah, any thoughts or questions or opinions on the limits?
Paul?
Yeah, nationally setting limits, and then when the pie gets thrown in the face and the region has issues, I'll be the one on the chopping block, not central government. You know, I can sort of see some of this heading down the line where New Zealand will turn into Flint, Michigan, a wee bit. And if no one knows what that is, then I'm sure there's a few documentaries out there for. You're nodding your head, Hayley, that you may sort of
understand the reference,
be,
yes.
yeah, thinking the same as well. But you know, national standards are going to put us all in a position where we play to the line we're at. And if it goes wrong, it could be at fault because of the national standards. We'll be the one on the job, or the region will be the one shown to the news as being the issue. Oh no, they didn't play the game. So
right, there's tools to bring it back into line, and but if we're in a rates constrained environment where funding is difficult and the tools are long and slow, you're litigating for years to get some rules in to actually bring it back into line where it should be for human health limits or ecosystem limits, then we need to make sure the tools are commensurate with the directive that we're giving in the legislation. It seems a little bit disjointed, and we'll probably talk about it a little bit further too, with the principles of the legislation sort of saying, you must do these aspects, but actually the processes and some of the regulatory relief components make it quite difficult in a just, juxtaposition between you've got to do this, but actually the tools you've been given to achieve that, and then you have to compensate or, provide regulatory relief if you're trying to take away elements of, if you consented, or putting layers on maps for outstanding landscapes because you don't want windmills on a certain area. Like those are the tensions between the different components of the system.
John. Yeah, thank you. Being that the central government's wanting to oversee all of this to a point, and being that regional councils do probably more modelling than monitoring, is that when we get to this pointy end of limits, are we going to see tension around whose science is right?
Through you, Chair, that's I think where the methodologies come into play. And so I think though the question that you've just posed is still live then. And so once we understand what those methodologies are, that's when that question will be asked, I think, by everyone with skin in the game, including ourselves.
So we're really arguing with every other sector and.
That's a good question, John. It's very good.
Thanks, Chairman. I'm now trying to reformulate my question. I'm just reading something. Under the new system, central and local government decision makers will be required to set binding environmental limits informed by environmental data and communities' aspirations. Central government will set national limits to protect human health informed by the Ministry of Health. Regional councils will set limits for the natural environment in their respective areas following nationally directed measures. How do those two fit together? Because if we are able to, notwithstanding there is some other legislation in place which has now said we can't set more stringent limits, but what if our community wants more stringent limits on their environmental limits? How does that work?
Through you, Chair, I believe that's unclear at this point in time.
So I'd be asking
Yes. Thank you.
and telling.
Marcy.
Oh, I think, yes, further to that, what we have is a problem of the grading environment at the time, so that those of us who live now see, like I was saying before, you go out and look at the river and it looks nice. But if you went there 20 years ago or 30 years ago, you'd see something different. And so what we have is a degrading baseline. And if we want to, if what this does is that basically supports that. And if we have a greater aspiration, as Phil tells us about achieving Haora, then I don't see that possible. And that we'll have to put up with and have no aspirations to improve things in the future. We'll have to accept things as they are. And they might be okay, but they're not as good as they could be. So it's rather a limited kind of thinking about protecting the environment. I think there should be somewhere in there that provision that the local community should be able to aspire to better conditions if that's what they want.
Through you, Chair, I would also add that they have been quite specific that limits must be expressed in measurable terms, which then becomes challenging if communities have decided that our limits should be set within the context of achieving Haora, for example, and so that kind of reignites that debate again.
Paul.
Yeah, just going back to what Maris is saying, and just about limit setting and the economics over environment thing, which is the issue. We strike it already with our consent holders. We've had discussions, Maris, where consent holders will fulfil their obligations to the letter of the law or to the limit, which will be what the consent requires them to. Nothing more. So if we're setting limits at a national standard, then we will get right to that limit and never set a precedent to improve. And that's the fear I have, because economics does it that way. Right.
I can't say enough about point 3. I think that when, to use a three-legged stool example, if you said that there is a part of our takiwā that has space and it has the right airflows and all that sort of thing, but actually we're already sitting in an overloaded, overstressed catchment, that this additional development, which might encourage economic growth, would adversely impact on everybody else below that thing. This is the bit we've done really badly, I believe, under the RMA, is not looking at how we affect other parts of, to pick up Councillor Rose's point, that it's a very long river catchments we have. So therefore what happens in, sorry, Mr. English, I'm not directing it at you, but whatever happens up above, say Dipton, still impacts what happens in New River Estuary. If the less water comes out of the Oreti, the less water that comes out of the Makarewa, that impacts New River Estuary. So we can have all the aspirations we like down here, but everything that goes on up above makes it more difficult. Until we have those conversations, which I think come in the spatial planning and come in the environmental limits. So looking at water allocation at the top of the catchment is as important as it is looking at it around about Winton or wherever the equivalent of Winton is, Matoda or whatever. The fact that we are looking at overstressed catchments now without factoring in what we don't know about how severe climate change is going to affect our inland areas, I like that idea because it means that you can be perhaps more cautious in how you look at what is possible under spatial planning. In terms of not increasing people's expectations, because I know within Otago that the conversation that is going to be really difficult is around the amount of water that vineyards and places like that take. And they're so well established, but in the long term, are some of those places going to be able to survive? They've got permits for water, but it's all determined by how much water there is. And we have businesses like that too. So how do we have those difficult conversations within spatial planning to meet that? So doing the limits before the spatial plan gives the spatial planners an indication of what is possible and not. If we could get that through, that might be helpful.
Thanks, Evan. I just got a comment, just thinking through this as national standards. As the regional, local standards, are they going to be weaker? Are they going to be, we can't force? We do have to set limits, environmental limits, but I get a feeling that the national standards will be pretty, I'm looking at just a more there as he's, I was thinking about this. I'm just, are we, we can go harder at this stage. We can make plans as we have done and maybe a national standard. Is that going to be weakened? If they're putting economics and saying, well, here's the play. If you're doing under this standard, nobody locally can tell you. You're playing by the national game rather than a localised game, dealing with local issues.
In terms of the higher rate.
Yeah, I'm just saying that we can go harder if we, as we've done, or when we see the local problems, we need to do this. But if they're going to come over and say, here's the national standards, yeah, as long as everybody's playing by that. But I mean, you'd have a very difference from Canterbury to, from a nitrate point of view, to Southland. If we had national standards and they're based on Canterbury nitrate levels, I hate to see what happens to Southland. So different landscape. And I'm just trying to understand that. They haven't indicated that, or?
There's no detail yet as to whether we're going to be constrained, as Councillor Morrison was talking about. If we can't, where the limits are going to set, where they stand. But I guess what we have seen in the past, or part of that process is the water and land plan processes of generally ecological limits are more strict than the human limits potentially. So yeah, it just depends on how those sort of things shake out. But I guess maybe Waituna is possibly a good example where there's a good body of science around what the health of that ecosystem can handle and can't handle. So managing that space, saying if this is the limit for what's appropriate in an ecological sense, then we need to have a conversation around how all those different aggregating factors all impact on the ecological limit or human health limit. So
yeah, through you, Chair, it is interesting that they do describe what happens if you wish to set looser limits than is prescribed in national standards, and there's a pathway provided for you to do that in terms of a justification report as to why a looser limit
They're not
is
the other way.
necessary.
Can
Not
I
that I'm
just,
aware of.
sorry, just before John, Mr. Moore. You're sitting there very quietly. I'm probably gonna ask you, have you got any view on that, or?
That's a good question.
That's why you're here.
I tend to agree with what Marcus said around the ecological standards. The threshold for ecological health is far more stringent than for human health, and I see that as actually leaving regional councils or whoever has that function with actually the hardest job when it comes to dealing with limit setting and allocation of resources, because managing to the ecological threshold is going to be harder than the human health threshold. So central government's effectively kicking that can back to you, whilst giving the appearance that it's all going to be nationalised.
I'd also add though that in consideration, obviously there's a requirement around the evidential basis, and that's where the methodologies come in. But in making those decisions around regionally set environmental limits, you are actually required to consider the effect on resource use. So it's not decoupled in and of itself. It is it's intertwined then with what are those implications for resource use if you set that limit.
John, Phil.
Yes. Yeah, I'll just be quick. When this first came out, there's a lot of noise around, at the moment, NES is the bottom line. You can't go below that. There's a lot of noise about flipping it. So central government pretty much set how low you could go. Kind of feeds into this. Is that narrative changed? Because that was quite a strong narrative. I was getting a lot of phone calls from consultants saying this is what we're concerned about. Has that narrative changed?
Not that I'm aware of. It still isn't the narrative.
They want to flip it. So there's your answer.
Yes. Phil.
Yeah, I remain kind of cynical because, and I've often said, expect the worst when it comes to this government and environmental outcomes and constraints on us. And I'm really nervous about the unstated methodologies for that they've suggested. And in my mind, I imagine something akin to the constraints have imposed on wastewater emissions, where there's set bans, and depending on your context, say this is you, therefore this standard applies. For instance, a nationally directed method could suggest you are to account for nitrates, sediment, and E. coli, but we'll leave P out of the equation. You're not allowed to consider that. That could be the methodology that they direct, which leaves us in a situation where it could mean that we cannot actually set limits that respond to the Hawara or the wellbeing needs of our catchments. And it really makes me nervous that those methodologies, nothing has been stated about the nature of those methodologies. We've got an existing methodology we were planning towards, Hawara-led integrated catchment management, and limits that were guided by that. So we had an existing methodology lined up, ready to go. The fact that there's no detail on what those methodologies are makes me super nervous, super cynical that there will be disempowered local voice around decisions around our environment. And so acknowledge the essential need for limit setting. They are essential, but they must be connected to local aspirations and catchment context.
I should say though, if there isn't a national standard methodology specified and we're looking to set a limit, then we are able to use our own approach to a methodology to setting that limit. So
it seems like such a fundamentally central thing that government will not leave that unattended to. So that seems unrealistic to expect. There will not be a specified methodology.
I was just going to, sorry, in the discussion, listening to Mr. Minister Macleay at the Hotel Town meeting, stating very clearly that farmers should be allowed to farm within a few rules. They'll do the right thing. Would indicate there's not going to be a hell of a lot of rules around for farmers. That's my way he was presenting it. It was very, they will do the right thing. I know what they'll do, their businesses. So we've got to be talking around all these standards. They're not going to be tighter anyway in regards to the economics of business. So, Lyndall.
Thanks. Two things. Following on from Councillor Morrison, I wonder if there's any value in providing some examples of our methodologies within our submission to say, actually, this is where we're at, and this is going to work. And secondly, Hayley, you used the term, and this is no judgment, but you used the term resource use. And for me, one of the main reasons that I'm on council is because it's not about use. Because in my mind, use is a consumptive exercise, and at some point there's nothing left. And so the terminology, I said earlier today that semantics are important. And the reason it was called the Resource Management Act originally was to manage, not exhaust. So I think that's a fundamental mindset that we need to remember, to manage our resources wisely so that our lifestyles and our economy and our environment continue.
To be fair, those were not my words.
No, I didn't think so. That's why I prefaced it with that. Yes.
Look, the more this conversation goes on, the more concerned we're getting. When you just package up what Jeremy just reminded me of, what McClay said, and bear in mind that there will be lobby groups out there now advocating exactly what McClay said, that farmers know what they're doing, and it could be very easy for the minister to put a pen line through our proposed water and land plan, our need for our determination to see farm plans as a way of managing our way forward instead of having to concede everything. Maybe there will be no consent. So I'm just trying to figure out how we best say, if we know what we're doing, how we actually get that message across, and that we're ahead of the game with a rational process that went through a very robust system of submissions and landing in a place. And then for 12 years we've been on this, and then through a court review process that's landed us in a place. And is the minister just going to put a line through that? I don't know.
Probably.
Roger.
Thanks. Look, just picking up on some of Phil Lyndall's comments there around the methodology, I'm wondering if a constructive way forward there might be to emphasise a focus on outcomes, so methodologies that result in ecological outcomes, that meet our community's expectations, and as a way of perhaps mitigating some of the risk around managing some of the drivers independently of outcomes. Because, as we're probably many of us correctly aware, in different locations, different drivers are going to have a more predominant impact and need greater or lesser attention. So I'd like to pick up on Lyndall's comment a wee bit there, I guess, as well, that really we need to remain focused on outcomes, achieving the outcomes that support our community's well-being, and that enables ongoing economic prosperity, economic use and growth. If we don't have a strong, healthy environment, we do not have the ability to continue some of these activities.
Thanks. Sorry, I've got something else I've just remembered. We must need to also keep in mind that if the government's focus is economic development and economic growth, they're thinking about international markets. And the international markets, will they or will they not be satisfied by a lowering of our standards? And will our clean, green, organic, in its broadest sense, product actually be devalued by lowering our standards of production?
Through you, Chair, I think that's quite a critical point for
Might have
Southland
market,
with its healthy rural sector, where it punches massively above its weight. That's a message I think that will land really strongly, and it's probably a message that others are making to the government through their own submissions and conversations with the government. We're an export-driven economy. They've got grand aspirations for us and export markets, and so we need to be cognizant to how some of these proposals would land. and, various trade agreements and requirements under those trade agreements as well.
And maybe remind them that Southern has led the current economic recovery under the current regime, not the new one, the current regime, and still managed to outperform the other regions of the country.
I'll take Stuart and then we'll keep moving.
Can I just be the old cracked record? Does all this hinder us from fulfilling our obligations under the treaty and the treaty settlements and our obligations of active protection of taonga and taonga species? And I would suggest, yes, it is going to hinder us all. And so I guess I'm just, as I say, a cracked record. We just need to keep making that point, because we talk about our obligations over here and over there and over there. If we can't even fulfil our own obligations, where's our integrity gone? Where's the integrity of our central government, our local government, if we can't even stick to those agreements and those contracts? And I'll say once again, Tahu's deal settlement was based on breach of contract. And so it will be. So will be the next breach of contract grievance being. I want to put all those grievances behind us and keep on keeping on. But I was just saying, how can we possibly fulfil our obligations through the treaty obligations, treaty settlements, or are we going to have to go through a whole thing all over again? And my generation, my grandchildren, and your grandchildren don't have to keep dealing with this stuff forever and ever, or we're going to get around to addressing it one day. And I would suggest that this is not going to allow us to address it, because protection of those taonga species are really based on, we can't drink clean water for a starter, then our whole lives are based on that clean water, and just goes from there. But anyway, cracked record, crack. Yeah.
Next topic was private property rights. So effectively, government's been pretty clear that prioritising the enjoyment of private property rights is a key goal of the legislation. Effectively, more activities will be permitted by design, so less regulatory approach, more non-regulatory approach. Fees will only be considered if they are more than minor, and opportunities for third-party engagement and the consenting process will be reduced. Regulatory relief regime is being established, so it basically requires council to provide some form of relief where some planning controls have a significant impact on the reasonable use of the land, and then applying controls relating to Indigenous biodiversity, outstanding landscapes, natural areas and sites of significance to Māori are some of those aspects where regulatory relief will be required. Effectively, the draft Environment Southern recommendations are supporting promotion of private property rights to boost innovation and economic growth. But note that private property rights are not unfettered in modern democratic society. They are subject to other fundamental rights, such as public rights to clean environment, human rights guaranteed by the Bill of Rights Act, and as Stu's just talked about too, around the treaty requirements of protecting taonga. Opposed regulatory relief regime is proposed due to creating an unfunded mandate on ratepayers and the risk of undermining the system goals. It could be a significant barrier to implementing environmental limits and the directions in regional spatial plans. The regulatory relief regime progresses amended so that it is workable for councils, for example, introducing exemptions where environmental limits are breached. So, yeah, effectively not supportive of it as a mechanism, but recognising that everybody contributes to use or loss of management of resources. But yeah, how do we do that in a rates constrained or fiscally constrained environment of providing relief or compensation?
I just wanted to flag that this is a new dimension that previously didn't exist in the RMA. And it seems to me that by opening the door to the conversation on the topic of regulatory takings, some might argue there's an asymmetry unless you also discuss the concept of environmental takings, which goes beyond the concept of simply a fine if you have an effluent discharge that was unplanned, because that's a fixed and limited thing. But one I think is important is because as governments change and governments tend to change and different priorities are emphasised, once you have opened this door, there is the potential for future governments to explore and expand on the issue of environmental takings as a balance to the concept of regulatory takings. Now, that leads us to an entirely different space again from a business point of view. And I see it leading us to a more litigious US-based style approach where you get your ass sued if you make a mistake. And it's not constrained by the fine, the limit for this is $2,000 or $6,000 or $10,000 for a thing. You get sued and you have to compensate for your damage that you've imposed upon the environment. So I know it's not a feature of this, but what I'm saying is it's opening a door to this possibility in the future. And so it's ratcheting up one level, it's making it possible to have these conversations. Previously, these are conversations that weren't going to feature at all. When you don't have regulatory takings, you don't have environmental takings. When you introduce one, the potential for the second one emerges. I think it's a really important thing to flag to the folk who are crafting this legislation because it's a risk they are creating for the future.
Very good.
Yes, Mr. Chair, just following up, and it reflects back to what Stuart said earlier, but under this thing on the being able to talk about the rights of Māori, which is actually a misnomer in this case because we're the only iwi that are involved, but looking at the Settlement Act, it is a known legislative fact. I think anybody within our takiwā who went and tried to claim that their private property rights were being infringed by the new regime need to remember that this has been here since 1998. It is not an unknown limitation on their exercise of their rights in certain places, statutory acknowledgements, tōpūnis, all that sort of thing. But it does potentially have the impact of limiting our commentary on some of the more egregious and optimistic aspirations of some people who only see the consumptive part of what this legislation might enable them to do. And that is of concern to me because I think that sometimes I know it sounds really probably a little bit arrogant, but sometimes we're the only player that sees the whole picture outside of yourselves, outside of your staff. The community only sees the bit they're interested in. We look at much more holistically, and because we're citizens and taxpayers too, we reserve the right to say so on behalf of the people who don't necessarily know what they're supposed to be looking for. This private property right thing, we all think we have it, but like it said at the beginning, there are already some mitigation, some limits against how far you can go with that. And I mean, pollution, the factory pollution, we've had that in our area where people who have lived in certain places have paid the price for living in those certain places when a business came in and didn't operate to the optimal standards, and the smell produced made living there very difficult. We must have the right to be able to do that and comment on that as a community, and included in that is where people don't necessarily see that taking this particular thing like straightening a river or whatever may impinge on what is in the best interest of us in terms of the birds and fishes and all those sorts of things. We're their voice. If we take that voice out, where does that go? Not all doom and gloom about it, but, and again, I support what Councillor Morrison says about the opening the door to a more litigious way of dealing with things that will come down to individual people being litigious rather than, how we've done it under the Act as it has been at the moment.
Take Paul, and then David.
Yeah, I'm just looking at number 4, the if regulatory relief. In the interests of our initial conversation about being more forthright and more firm in our approach, I'm wondering if we actually, and to Phil's point to a certain degree, do we want to even, I'm up to my colleagues to see how they feel, do we want to even include the if option and perhaps find a way to suggest the exemptions as the example as an alternative rather than as a, oh, well, if you're going to do this, could you do this? But I'm open to canvassing the opinion of the room on that one.
Kev, I think you've said if because it's currently a feature that is proposed in the.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that, but also in the interests of being not offering them too much, just wondered.
I think in the interest of being a bit positive about some of this, we need to put on the table that there has been some outrageous claims about the colours you can paint things. There has been people submitting on things that don't even live in their community. There has been supermarkets putting submissions in against other supermarkets purely from commercial, but so there has been some really bad behaviour that needs to be checked somehow. But in saying that, not right across the board, but surely we can accept that those sort of behaviours are unacceptable. And have led to a lot more cost and indeed stopping perfectly good things going ahead. But maybe this is too far the other way.
If it's helpful, perhaps an example in consideration of where regulatory relief, if introduced, could be challenging for the implementation of flood protection works in Southland, for example. Then, building on the earlier conversation this morning around slowing the flow and, the place for forests and interception, reducing runoff, speed, and land, that our ability to manage flooding could be constrained if this is implemented.
Perhaps I could take the opposite view there, Councillor. One of the things which is not popular but has been discussed throughout the country is removing gravel or redistribution of gravel in the rivers. So that has got some merit in terms of some flood mitigations. And so, look, I'm broadly in favour of this here, with promoting private property rights there. And I don't see too big a door opening for litigation, as Councillor Morris has indicated there. So I might lean a bit to the right, but I think this government certainly is wanting to get economic growth. I don't want to see it at the expense of the environment, but there's got to be a balance there somewhere. Just in answer to that, Jeffrey, I'd be inclined to agree that individual property rights are important in some respects, but actually this regulatory relief framework has the potential to create barriers to actually implementing some of those environmental constraints, or not constraints, but those environmental aspects that we're looking to enhance. And I do consider that, and I spoke to Phil about this some time ago, I consider that this will open the door to the environmental relief going forward. If we look at what's happening with the Selwyn community In Canterbury, I think the cost of water treatment is going to be something like about 400 million for that community. And it's actually, they are, you can argue they're contributors, but also the vast percentage of the contributions coming from the farming community. So at what point does that community actually take a stand and say, well, actually, this is actually, what's happening here is actually affecting our right, our position. We need to action that. So I think that there is a lot of risk around this, and to the point that Phil made too, around change of governments. That will to effect.
Through the chair, effectively, there's no sort of case law at the moment around compensation or how much you pay. So there's, I think there's potential for a body of case law to be established and a number of appeals and disputes around the quantum associated with how much is enough to pay for the loss or the taking. So,
I mean, through you, in addition to that, one of the challenges for us in forming a position on this is we just don't know how much this will cost a regulator when it receives requests from communities. Please regulate us. We are concerned about these effects or the outcome of these activities. And so in effect, it makes it difficult for us to look across the system of tools that will be gifted to us and say which are going to be the really useful tools in achieving the outcomes that the community is asking of us. It also introduces potentially, and I'm sure Phil's colleagues in the legal world will look forward to this, although the government says that this shouldn't be an overly legalistic process, but I suspect we are humans and we quite like inventing bureaucracy. I say that as a bureaucrat. But that starts to create a whole layer of challenge that doesn't currently exist in this system. There are pathways for businesses, individuals, communities to participate in the creation of rules. They're provided for in these proposals. This layers in an additional layer of challenge that doesn't currently exist in the system. And so, there's inefficiencies in that. Every time you introduce bureaucracy, it introduces inefficiencies. At the core of the system, one of the things the government's trying to achieve is reducing cost through efficiency. So that's just some thoughts for you to reflect.
Morris, so.
I thought this came about, the particular example that was used was where landowners who had a patch of bush on their place couldn't do anything with it because it was identified as a significant natural area. So, I mean, it's a pretty narrow type of thing. And I mean, if it's expanded out, I'm not sure if it is going to be expanded out to a whole lot of other activities, is it?
Through you, Chair, yes.
It could be.
Yes.
Well, yeah, well, it really does open a big can of worms, as Phil says as well. Not only takings for one thing, but, the sky's the limit. It's very unhelpful. I think what you say there is to say, and perhaps we could have strengthened that by saying that, that the way that this could be used needs to be tightly constrained so that it's not, can't just be done anything like, the council driving a tractor down, not a tractor, coming onto somebody's land and interfering with the farm's ability to drive his cows into the dairy shed. That's, this is, it has to be tightly constrained how it can be used.
That's probably the question I was going to ask. So what's the examples? But I know that was the intention they were talking about. Obviously, bush, farmers can't clear a bit of bush. Let's give them something for it.
Yes, and in fact, I think
but they haven't defined, got that very narrow point. They haven't got any, I take it, of any borders within this discussion.
Infrastructure development.
And it's often one of these rules where if you do put it out there, the interpretation in 10 years' time could be absolutely different to how they can use that. So need to be very careful. Like for the ratepayers, if it was centrally funded, yeah, that'd be great. But the local ratepayers can't afford to be fronting out money like that, I don't think, personally.
Yeah, through you, Chair, this is absolutely one of those ones where you need to consider it against other proposals by the government, in particular the rates capping one, and that it may place certain tools in your toolbox beyond reach and affordability, which means we need to look at other tools to achieve the outcome. There's also significant questions about how this will work, who's compensated and for how long.
Yeah.
What kind of demonstration do you have to give as the party seeking compensation for regulation as to loss of value? Some may argue that your purchase price already reflects the constraints, be they regulatory constraints or other constraints that are present on the land, or your market value, etc. So there's a lot of detail there which raises a huge amount of questions as to how a regime like this will work and be fair.
Do I see someone else? Yeah. No, it was Alistair, wasn't it?
I think-
And then John, sorry.
I think where
See
all
that.
this sort of raised its ugly head was where limits are going to be imposed. And therefore that reduces the price of the land and reduces the the disposable income of the people on the land. And that was where it was, and this was probably 3 or 4 years ago. And that's probably where a lot of this stuff's coming from, because it was going to be an horrendous number.
Yes, so
So it's dangerous.
the limits up and down to allow more
Yeah, more money, more.
better return on it.
Yeah.
Then you could expect to be, unless you could expect to be compensated for that loss.
That was the expectation, yes.
John.
Because the other people within the community were benefiting.
John.
I guess the flip side of this is if this all plays out around property rights, is the community going to see funds dry up for doing good things like putting in wetlands and plantings and all such like this? All that side of things going to dry up because those organisations don't have the protection and that asset's going to be protected going forward. So, excuse me, there's going to be some quite large unintended consequences that we just think we sort of take for granted at the moment. Once that attitude change comes through, much to Phil's point, that more of an American style type thinking will happen. And yeah, I just think there's a lot of good things that we have going at the moment, which might be the end of them.
Can I just, sorry, Jeff.
Look, I was just going to make a comment on that. I think the original proposal that was given was around compensating for retaining native vegetation or something. But if you extrapolate that out to try and get compensated for every disadvantage in any business or so forth, we need to be very careful about that because no council can certainly fund compensation for all of those things. So yeah, I certainly have a different view on that.
So the reason comfortable where you're getting I think, like, as I say, if it was for a specific thing, around the native, which I think it was originally.
Yes, it was.
And now it's all very broad. Probably support in a way, but then again, to be very careful of how it's written up, I suppose. I don't know, what's people's thoughts? Is that comfortable with that or what?
I think what you've articulated is sound.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Keen to keep it moving. I've got you for another
Yeah,
hour and 10 minutes and still a fair bit to traverse. So I think we're going to talk to the Treaty Waitangi rights and interests piece.
No, we can't have that.
Your turn.
So we've got a couple of slides through you, Chair, on Te Tiriti Māori rights and interests, and it flows from a discussion at Turupataia in December. So a number of you were present at that hui where there was a directive to the senior management group that supports Turupataia to prepare some common submission points, which are what are up on the slide in front of you. And I guess the observations that were in the last slide are really part of these submission points. I'll just combine the two slides and talk through together. So as you know, we have a very long-standing relationship with Ngāi Tahu, Kemura Hiku and the councils in this part of the country. What we did as a collective was look at our charter and how the charter was relevant to the proposals on the table, the new legislation that's going through, and what should be highlighted as a result of that analysis. And the first point that the PO thought was worth elevating was the importance of meaningful mana whenua participation. So because we've got those long-standing arrangements between councils and mana whenua down here,
and when I went to say, because I'm trying to be so polite, Councillor Rodway and I but also Councillor Roy and I have had over the years had a very, very long relationship. So part of the benefits of how this has worked for this part of the world is that you have a number of people who have 30 years of more of relationship building, and to put it in the terms that Tātipini is so fond of reminding councils and government about, you know, every 3 years you all guys have a prefrontal lobotomy and everybody forgets everything that's been done before and you all think that you have to redesign the world from scratch. We are still doing what we have been doing, maintaining the positions that we have been maintaining, with the addition of some useful legislation that came in after we already existed, to give us a few more tools. But the consistency of viewpoint that you're getting has been what has enabled you to build up the things like the land and water plan, and to be able to look at the coastal plan and see that initial mahi was done when the Act was relatively new, when big plans were relatively rare. But also Southland is quite different in the land mass issue. And I think to take all that away and not have that regional flavour with the regional experience and the local obligations that you have is quite scary. This is a place that has got a lot of particular mention within the Ngāi Claims Settlement Act, and the deed of settlement has Tōpuni has statutory acknowledgement areas, which would be, I mean, even with that, we do have to constantly remind people that it's not just words on paper, it actually has effect and impact. And we want to make sure that when we haven't done anything ever before, for instance, have a conversation about the economic, the seed-bound economic zone, there's somebody around the table that actually remembers that we actually have got a 200-mile economic exclusion zone, and this council has a part in protecting that. You know, so, but we have a part in advocating for it. Where does that sit within all of this if our discussions are downplayed, if we're not in the places where decisions are being made or where the influential conversation, even this workshop, would we be allowed to be at this workshop? Would somebody challenge our right to be here because we're not elected or whatever, you know?
Thanks. Lyndall?
Yeah, I support the points so far, and just, I don't know whether it's relevant necessarily, but the Regulatory Standards Act that is now in place has made it more challenging for our treaty partners, and I don't know whether there's a way that we can pick at that as well at the same time, or whether it needs to be considered in the broader consequences of things that happen. That did come to mind.
Just in regards, so this is what ES is
No,
putting
so
out, is this the whole group or two
so the PO group, that senior management group, which has got representatives from the 7 councils in Te Marama, who've come up with a set of points, which has been taken back to each individual organisation for consideration and use as appropriate. So there's not a requirement to use what's been developed, but it's there as a resource where there's some collective thinking on that and shared concerns. Probably one to highlight is that certainty for treaty settlement instruments during transition. So the bill has some provisions which provide a 2-year transitional window for the Crown and post-settlement and entities like Ngāi Tahu to decide how settlement redress will carry into the new system. There's no default position or protection if agreement's not reached, which obviously has a number of risks around it. So that's something that the group felt we needed to, there needs to be absolute certainty and protection there. The last point there is, you know, we've got some good mechanisms available at the moment. Things are working well. You know, we would like
like those mechanisms to carry, that are working to carry forward. So they're the submission points from the PO.
On the reason, sorry, Hugh, I was just going to say, certainly with the relationship we had, and this is supportive of these. This is a continuation of what we do. So, we've got Lyndall, and then you, and then David.
Yeah, just one question. The certainty for treaty settlement instruments, do we only want that certainty during transition, or do we want it forever?
So I think actually the longer wording that we've got in the table that's circulated does talk about during the transition and post as well. So you will tidy that up a wee bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, Evelyn, is there not some special legislative conditions that Ngāi Tahu have with the Crown that is that being bypassed as well, or can?
We are of the belief that there are some members of the coalition that have been exercising their brains with the help of their offshore advisors to find a way of either de-emphasising the rights and things that are in the Claim Settlement Act because they come from places that don't necessarily endorse Indigenous rights. But I mean, we're taking a government organisation to court because of their breaches. We're not adverse to the whole of the Crown. I think an appeal to King Charles would be forthcoming on that basis, but I think it is under threat. I wouldn't sit secure that the fact that it is an act of Parliament would actually save us, even though it is a long well established and it was the cheapest way of Bex is coming to save me. The cheapest way that the Crown could deal with the mitigation of the many breaches of the sale and purchase agreements and all those sorts of things and colonisation on Te Waiponamu. But I think our biggest threat is in ignoring it as a potential. I wouldn't console myself with the fact that we have an act of Parliament and everybody knows that we do, to say that it would necessarily be safe from some ambitious anti-iwi politician. If they could get enough votes, because it appeals to a certain segment of our community still, sadly. Bex is saving that.
Kia ora, ko Rebecca Blythe toku ingoa for any of the councillors that I have not met yet. I work for Tio Marama as the holder of all things planning on behalf of the iwi, so principal advisor. The point in the slide is referring to contextually the changes proposed in the planning and natural environment bills, where because the treaty settlements have been established post the RMA 1991, they are formed on the basis that there's an acknowledgement that the existing legislative environment existed. And so the RMA, some of the elements within the treaty negotiation spaces were, that's in the RMA, so we don't need to worry about that so much in the Settlement Act. And so the Crown has provided a pathway through the bill to work, but with a sunset clause that expires out of the legislation within a 2-year timeframe, to understand and incorporate treaty settlement matters into the legislation after it has been set. And so that's quite tricky. The timeframe is tricky, the sunset clause is tricky, and the repurposing a piece of legislation into a new system is tricky. And so it doesn't provide certainty that there will be agreement reached between the Crown and all of the iwi who have settlements. It doesn't provide certainty about how those instruments function in the new system or in a transition system. So in answer to your question, it is not clear and it is tricky. And there needs to be some, these points have been developed by the councils, and we have observed the formation of these points by the councils, and we have endorsed them as acceptable and right and good and kapai, crack on. And so we are supporting the councils and saying it's not clear, particularly for those who have to implement the new system. Because what do you, how does that roll? So yes and no, essentially, is the answer to the question.
And all I'm asking is that we, the regional council, support the intent of that settlement. So whatever direction it takes, at least support what was the intent on that settlement. And as I say, I don't want us to be in grievance forever and ever in the day. And I thought we'd gone past that grievance mode and we've gone into development mode and such like, but we keep getting dragged back into so-called grievance. And so we need to keep on top of that. And as I say, I challenge myself every day and I challenge you all too. So where's our integrity if we can't make an agreement? It used to be just a handshake once upon a time. We know that doesn't work anymore. But surely signatures and such like should work. And if we agree on this is the way, this is the intent of what we want to do, then let's carry on and do that. And I'll say it here that the Ngāi settlement is not just for the benefit of Ngāi, it's for the benefit of the whole community, especially in environment and resource management, environmental management. And so what was the intent of those settlements? And we need to hold on strong there, because once again we talk about changes that happen with triennials and changes at central government. So what is it? Where is the continuity in any of this? The only place I can see any continuity is the iwi input into and for resource management and such like. And everyone touched on if we keep going down the route we are, and there is no necessity for true consideration of environmental management degradation and such like internationally, I believe that it's only through treaty requirements in the protection of Tongan species that's stopping us getting a flood of international conglomerates coming in here and doing whatever it is that they want. I don't know what's going on in the world anymore, to tell you honestly. It's such a mess. But anyway, I just asked that you consider that what was the intent? What's the intent of those treaty settlements? And can we support that we carry on there? Also, regionally, you're dealing with one iwi. How can central government possibly say, tangata whenua, this is how you all go and work? Even my toe sit there and scratch his head and say, would you fellas stop fighting up there and just get it sorted out and get settlement and so we can all carry on and develop, you know? And so you can't put iwi all into one box and say mana whenua, this is how mana whenua will be treated or acted upon from central government, because this is not all the same. Mana whenua talks about the mana, those people who are in that place. Tangata whenua talks about those people who are right across the board. So kia ora.
Oh, good. Thanks, Rebecca, for your comments too. So this discussion. So David?
Yeah, look, I was just wanting some clarification over the second point to do with cultural effects. And is that getting to the well-beings and how they're coming out? I guess what I was thinking it might mean is around water quality and around if wastewater goes into any water, then it voids your cultural beliefs. But I'm open to understanding what that is.
there's been a couple of things that have come, or that I've experienced in other places, but has come to the fore here. One was the moving of water from one catchment to another, which by and large we oppose, because it's a little bit like saying that a vein that goes one place can be moved to take blood to another place without considering whether the original place still needs it. The other thing that would come under this, it's not so much a consenting change, it would be part of the spatial planning and part of, but we do comment on in consents, which is the kind of vegetation that is used and where it's used, and the encouragement of using, say in a riverbank or nearby. She's back again. Would be things like we've always talked about, kahikatea or kōtukutuku or things like that, which are river bounding plants that don't mind wet feet. Also add to bird life, all those sorts of things. And my particular hate, the permitting of willow species as river management tools, as compared to there may be other tools which perfectly well manage the rivers in times past. Could we think about those? But those are the couple of things, but also sometimes it will include the other in-water species or the proximate species, which I think may go back to that conversation we had earlier about people wanting to sue because the identified important Indigenous biota and insects and things like that became an issue. It became an issue in Northland when they did the first SNAs, significant natural areas. So I think if we look at all of those things, it's not one cat fits all, but cultural effects could be also how you use a waterway or what it was traditionally used for and has become less possible. And that would include the rest of the community. Places where you used to be able to go to swim, if you put certain activities in, they can't access those areas anymore. Or if you put a wharf in a certain place or a boat landing place or whatever, all of those things that are included in plans. Cultural can be wider than just what iwi culture is. And we do often comment on things like that and say, this has been a place where people have effectively launched boats for years. Just that the boats are different now doesn't mean that we don't launch boats and exercise our right to go out and recreate on the river or the ocean. Is that helpful?
So I'll just Evelyn's given quite a broad overview of some of the matters that we think about when we're thinking about giving feedback on what effects a proposal might have on cultural values and associations. Within the system, as is proposed in the bills, there are changes to the pathways through which iwi and Maitahu participate within that process. One of those ways is around being identified as an affected party because of potential effects, cultural effects and wider effects, as Evelyn has described some of them. Within the new system, there are changes proposed to the notification pathways and the legal tests as to who will be identified as an affected person. So this point is not just about cultural effects, it's actually across the system that there is a shift in and therefore a potential risk because of the unknown factors within the system of excluding elements or magnitude of effects. So a geeky plenary terminology is under the RMA, there is a consideration of effects on the environment and effects on people. And to follow certain notification pathways, full notification, limited notification, non-notification, you have to, the council has to decide whether the effects are minor, less than minor, more than minor, significant. And there are particular legal tests and evidential tests around that decision process. Under the new system, there are changes, incremental changes to those tests and pathways. And so there is a risk at certain effects if they're not considered appropriately, or those making those decisions are sufficiently understanding that decision they're making, aka how can a council officer determine the cultural effects if they're not provided some advice on what that might be to determine that it's now more than minor to identify parties to be involved in a consenting process. Very technical, very plenary geekery, but that is the context of that comment, and it doesn't just apply to the cultural element of an effects assessment. It's actually a system-wide shift, and so it's just highlighting there could be a risk because there's a change in approach. So that's under the Natural and Built Environment Bill. Under the Planning Bill, there are different tests, but let's not go there because that's like
We'll just
brand on fire.
Yeah.
The only other thing I want to add to those two pieces was, I guess the new system is talking about mapping cultural effects.
Yeah.
So if it's not mapped, there's a presumption that it's significant and therefore not considered as part of a decision-making process. So I think the new system is basically trying to draw lines around areas that are significant from a cultural perspective, and if it's not mapped, then the consideration of the process and the political effects is just level and just talked about, makes it a whole lot more difficult to consider those aspects in the decision-making processes.
And we have very serious concerns because some cultural effects are not appropriate to impact.
Okay. Well, reasonably, I take it to reasonable comfort in those points. And thanks for all the comments in regards to that.
So I'm just conscious of time. We've got
Yeah.
about 40 minutes left with you and a few topics to traverse. Centralisation, I think it's probably pretty well known. We've talked about a lot of it already. Effectively, the role of localism in the decision-making process is changing. And we're still trying to figure out exactly what that looks like. So basically, what we're looking to land on centralisation, that centralisation may undermine a weakened local democracy by eroding regional autonomy and authority, reducing the ability to meet specific needs and priorities of individual regions, one-size-fits-all policies, disregard local evidence, weaken accountability by distracting decision makers from affected communities, implementation workloads for council and networks, regional stakeholders, and mana whenua those processes that we work through to get good decisions get compromised. And then recommend amendments to limit the level of ministerial discretion, more clearly define the scope of parameters and intervening power. So we require consultation with councils when developing national instruments, and then limit the minister's power to make final decisions on assets which are funded by central government. So yeah, I guess we've had a bit of a steer already. Unless there's anything more to add, keen to continue the conversation because we've got emergency management and rates capping still to have in the next 40 minutes.
One point I'd emphasise is that by undermining and weakening local democracy, they're placing democratic legitimacy at risk, which could compromise the enduring success of the new, whatever shape the new legislation takes. If you impose it on the people, they will resist, whereas if you take the people with you, they're more likely to accept it. It's more likely to endure.
Okay.
Thank you. Along those lines, weakening local democracy, we talk about consulting with their communities, but mana whenua are part of that, not regional stakeholders, I want to say. So elevating the discussion that we just had in this space as well, I think is really important.
I think there's a bit of a weariness of having the minister decide.
Oh, and absolutely.
How, I think throughout New Zealand, probably people will be saying that. So I think we've had a bit of a feel for that anyway. So be happy with that in regards to that. Take it. Right. Good.
So we have two more topics to cover on the resource management topic, and they are consenting and transition. So I will try to walk you through the slides that we have relatively quickly. So consenting framework, I think Bex has helpfully provided a good summary of the consenting aspect, but I'll provide just an outline to cover the key points briefly. So for consenting, the key changes include changes to activity status with the intention of streamlining the process. So 4 categories are proposed to be used in the new system. Public notification is a big change because as suggested, it is going to be limited to when significant adverse effects are present. And the ability for consenting officers to go down the pathway when there are special circumstances, that is going to be removed, that is in the new system. And a small change, depending on the view, it could be a significant or minor. It's only going to be open to people living in the region, qualifying residents. And hearings are to be changed significantly. So rather than being a default pathway, they are going to be held in specified circumstances, including when the applicant requests it or a submitter requests it, with the condition that the consenting authority believes it's the most effective and efficient means of testing the issues. The other potentially significant proposal is that conditions to resource consent cannot be added unless it is directly disconnected to a provision in the regional or national rule, or the applicant agrees that it will either give rise to positive effect or avoid remedy, minimize, offset, or compensate adverse effects. So the system that may lead to the system being more user-friendly, but it raises some concerns that have been highlighted by our senior consent officer. The other point I wanted to cover briefly is that it is proposed that all notified applications are to be decided by external players such as independent commissioners. And on the next slide, I will take you through some a few implications and draft ES positions with also letting you know that the coverage will be broader in the actual submission that we will make available for your review. These are just a snapshot of what we might have in that submission. So the requirement for all notified applications to be decided by independent commissioners will likely reduce flexibility and add cost, especially when the council and the applicant have resolved all matters. And so we propose that we recommend that this be opposed. And the restrictions on imposing consent conditions, again, it reduces flexibility of the consenting process and could lead to more applications being declined. So the recommendation from our consenting team was to strongly oppose this proposal, this aspect. And limiting submissions to qualifying residents, there has been some debates, but we recommend opposing this due to the unnecessary administrative burden it may create without achieving the intended outcomes. So those are the key recommendations we have developed.
Just in regarding to qualifying residents in a region living on the border of Otago and Southland, I've got a fence between the two regions, and I decide to build a wind farm or something on my property. The neighbours next door can't have a say in it. Is that the region we're talking about? Like, as in, I understand why, because we don't. People in Auckland will oppose things that are happening in Southland. They have no idea. It's just because they do that. And it's to get rid of that sort of thoughts in dealing with regional issues. But when you look at neighbouring regions, build a factory on this side of the fence, you guys, you're downwind from me, I don't care. You know, that is and they don't have a say. So there is a
pick your postal address wisely.
My grandfather.
yeah, but yeah. So I mean, I understand that maybe that's not people outside the region who do have an effect, physical, environmental effect. Probably should have still have about to have a say. I would have thought.
A bit,
I don't know, you're in
so
the
I've made a term of be standing, and a neighbour would have standing rather than a boundary.
Phil?
I'm just going to observe it. On occasions, we've seen organisations rather than residents present, and in some cases, drawing on expertise from outside, like Otago University, for instance, talking on something relating to research insights around stuff happening in Milford, for example. Would that exclude, or would you need then to work through a resident? A resident has engaged an expert from Otago who's got research insights into a particular issue.
Through the chair, the definition of residence has been such that it allows offices, companies can be included if they have an office within the region. So yeah, it's not limited to individuals to second.
Yeah, and we do note that there are a lot of representative agencies or entities that many Southlanders belong to who have a Dunedin-based office because they put Otago and Southland together for better or worse. So we would probably see, and this is why we've referenced the administrative burden, you'd probably see proxy behaviour. Like, you know, what's the point if there's a loophole that large? Sorry, that's probably a bit flippant about a serious matter.
My point is similar because we get to see a lot of submissions that come from quasi even government agencies that are not based in Southland at all. They may have a worker that is here, but the regional office could be in Christchurch. Because of decisions made by organisations to base themselves where the population masses and they can be more effective and more cost effective, and government decisions and all those sorts of things. So I think that is quite anti-democratic in some ways because the expertise that they bring to the conversation is important. They don't do it not talking to local people on the ground, but they do it with the expertise that they bring, and we would be, as a community, and the decisions that would be being made would be less informed as a consequence of excluding them. On the other hand, having, I think the term is Queen Street farmers, 20 or 30 Queen Street farmers having a conversation about a decision that you make in the wilderness of Fiordland is probably, or in support of having the overthrow of the ILT or things like that, because they don't have one where they are, so therefore what's the problem? We need to be mindful that there's two sides to that coin, but where the Queen goes or NGOs or whatever apply, it's been deliberate decisions that have taken their local offices away. It's, they go where they're directed and they go where the economic or logistical sense is. We still need their voices because they have the expertise.
So
Yeah, couple of points. I sat on the Regional Pest Management Plan hearing last time, and we were treated to some fantastic submissions from Canada and Europe generally about their dear domestic cat and how, there's quite some controversy, but and apart from the fact that that was kind of inconvenient and mildly entertaining at times, we were able to park there and assess things properly. And I would caution against becoming too protectionist of our own special region, because everybody thinks their own region is special, and there are things to learn from outside expertise and outside experience. So I kind of understand the intent of that suggestion, but I would also oppose it on the basis that actually a fully informed decision can also takes into consideration international and global knowledge that we may not have locally.
So if we get any, is everybody happy with those positions? That's what
Mhm.
we need to know. We bit of grey area in some of the.
Oh, can I, sorry, ask another question? I know you want to keep moving, but what's the definition of an independent commissioner?
By themselves.
No.
Effectively, not aligned
It's
to.
not it.
No.
You're asking the question.
I am asking.
Through Chair, it's effectively not aligned to a councillor that's got to make a decision.
So
Someone
as a,
independent of council.
so of that council or of any council, because having my commissioner's certificate, could I then sit on a hearing panel in Northland because I have the qualification?
Yes.
But it's just not my own region. Yeah. Job opportunities.
So we're all good on there.
No, nothing about the regional
Yeah.
situation.
The last, through the Chair, the last topic to cover under this session is transition. And I just put a timeline for your information as a refresher perhaps. So late enactment is expected mid-2026, and by towards the end of this year we are expecting the first package of national directions, the rest to be landing in 2027. And by late 2027, the expectation is that the regional spatial plan is notified. And by the following year, mid-2028, decision on regional spatial plan is expected. And the following year, early 2029, is when the natural environment plan and land use plan are expected to be notified. And 2023, decisions on those plans are required. And the following, you see the transition frame consenting time frame. So within the bills, there is a section that covers what's going to happen during the transition. So the transition period will begin 1 month after the bills become the legislation receives royal assent, and then it will end on the date to be determined by the government, and it's supposed to be later than the end of 2027. So yeah, some uncertainty remains, but this is quite a tight time frame to undertake all the to complete all the proposed tasks in time. So in terms of our recommendations, so basically that just it gives more details about what I've just summarized. And if I can click to the next slide to focus on our recommendations. So the council could oppose the proposed time frame and offer alternatives, such as extending the time frame by 9 months to support effective delivery. And this is in line with what may be shared by the regional sector, although things are still progressing. That is one option for this council. We could also strengthen the obligation for central government. I mean, we could request that they strengthen the obligation to consider regional circumstances and evidence when developing national instruments. For example, we could recommend that a mechanism be included in the bill to require them to document consideration of regional environmental capacity and pressures. Council could also recommend that the government introduce a statutory advisory role for regional councils in the process. Perhaps the other option is to request implementation feasibility assessments for proposed national instruments. At the moment, the bills appear to contain very minimal details around how national instruments are expected to be developed and who are to be consulted. So council could suggest that more details are included in the bill to give more certainty to councils as to how about the process and the content of the national directions to come.
This is Shana's what's good for the goose is good for the gander moment.
I kept on looking at 2027. I was going, I don't know what after that. I said myself.
I think that's the point, Jeremy. Local government reorganisation runs right across the timeframes, and that's critical. How can you do that with any certainty? At least we won't be here, and goodness knows what the council, the district councils in their part-time role of gazing over the fence. So, that surely you can't ignore that as something that would dramatically affect those timeframes.
Yeah, we might still be here, I should say.
But these seem sensible, especially extending the time, adding a little bit more space to do the work, another potential checks and balances.
This is going to take time. And sorry.
Can I ask the team, apologies I've been in and out of it, but did it raise the issue around one of the big risks to resource management reform is local government reform? We've raised that conversation. Great, perfect.
But that's one of the comments around the regional sector when we're discussing it. I think Smith was saying this is just going to take huge amounts of time.
And I think it's been
And we're just trying to cram it, the mistakes will happen.
The resource required to usher ourselves through that process. It was a community-driven process with limits and conversations and hearings. It's a big process. It's going to be resource heavy to do the spatial planning, and then you've got a regulatory system after that as well to go through. And there's not enough detail yet of exactly how that's going to work, but it's going to take resource in
and not just our own and our treaty partners' resource, but actually communities' resource, because inherent in this is a consideration around non-regulatory methods first. Well, that implies a lot of community will, collective action, and we know our rural communities and our urban communities as well are already overworked in supporting themselves, day-to-day life. So it's considerable for all of us.
Not a question, it's more of a statement, just in reflection of Eric's point earlier. If only we knew your agenda.
I
was going to say, really useful timeline diagram earlier in the previous slide, and the request is when the time comes for us to give submission feedback on local government reform, that would be a really useful base slide to then overlay the local government reform proposal to demonstrate, the crunch points, bottlenecks for this.
We are working on a Gantt chart. It's huge, and part of the request for additional time is that actually some of the requirements around timeframes are quite add up. As someone once said, the math ain't mathin'. And so we're working through that at the moment to actually kind of provide that underpinning fact around needing that additional time. Also referencing your point around democratic legitimacy and community involvement.
So we're happy with that? Sounds good.
It's getting late, so we're
Next couple of
getting very
time. Management. So key points of this basically is looking at essential infrastructure. What's the definition of what is the definition of intensive essential infrastructure? So effectively, at the moment, flood banks aren't deemed critical infrastructure or essential infrastructure. We talk about free waters and roads and those sorts of things, but it's essential that the flood bank systems and processes are included in that definition because they are super important. And that recognition would improve clarity, powers and consistency with funding pathways, etc. And also the recognition that marae are also essential infrastructure in that process with the response components as well of managing states of emergency and those sort of factors. So unless there's any questions, I'll keep ticking.
Good.
Yes.
Group officers and group managers. So just trying to clarify these roles and recognise the professional technical components of those. They're not administrative services, but the bill's sort of talking about administrative services. And then effectively what we're seeking is the bill should explicitly recognise the professional function, ensure appropriate capability, capacity and resourcing be maintained.
Resourcing, yes.
Sounds good. And iwi Māori participation, Bill's current wording risks inconsistent or unsuitable Māori representation. Representation should reflect recognised mana whenua authority and expertise in that space. And as has been said, it's a whole lot easier down here in the south with Ngā Tahu ki Mirihiku supporting us. So effectively, we are seeking, I guess, stronger, better clarity to anchor governance representation from a mana whenua perspective in the emergency management space.
Mr. Chair, this is where I take off my te ao marama hat and put on my emergency management hat. It's been a difficulty that we have had the whole time I've been doing the role, is that we come and sit at the table at all levels, but statutorily we have no place because of whoever wrote it in the first place, and it's not significantly better in this. So because we are not considered to be a funder like the councils are, sometimes there's a bit of challenge that I sit at that mana to mana level at chairs or mayors. But in actual fact, whilst I would like to split the roles and have somebody else do one, I'm the only mug in the game at the moment. It's really important, given that what we have seen last week is local marae and local community emergency management responders standing up, but they actually don't necessarily have a place at the table when talking about preventive solutions and looking at post-incident stuff, unless they're actually fortunate enough to be there as part of another role. There's a lot of expertise and there's a lot of expectation. We at Waihopai have built our marae on the basis that we will be a centre for support for emergency management response, and the conversations have been really positive, but it's not necessarily supported by the way that legislation may end up. And I know that when Tapu Allen was the minister, she was very keen for that to change, but under subsequent ministers that has sort of disappeared. But if this council could be supportive on behalf of all the councils, we do play a role. We don't ask to be really funded or anything, but I will point out to you all, unsurprisingly, when I sit in these meetings, I am the only unpaid person sitting in the room. Everybody else is representing an organisation and is there with their salary or their whatever behind them. I'm not complaining poverty, don't misunderstand me, but it does speak to the undervaluing of the role that iwi play in these, and yet the significant events in Te Waipounamu, Kaikoura, Christchurch, the fire out at the Waituna wetlands, Blue Cliffs, all those things, we have had people there and we have sat in on the meetings, and I think that it's important, and I don't know how to get it across to, it sounds petty and all the rest of it, but I think that it's really sad that I even have to say it, but that the legislation doesn't seem to have advanced the status of iwi. And this is one instance where, although Ngāi Tahu are the face that comes in, we also go and talk to our Mata Waka members, because they are affected by these disasters. It's just that the response at a statutory level comes from us. So,
yeah, what's people's thoughts on the position? Just building on our relationship. As far as I'm concerned, I think it's reasonable. I don't
Need the relationship.
Yeah. Is there a word?
I remember hearing the story, the response from my Tahu was quicker and more fulfilling than central government or regional government in some emergencies. the pallets of clothing, food, and everything that arrive a day or two afterwards.
And with Gabrielle, we put
Appreciate
stuff on the
Yeah.
we put stuff on the Navy ship that happened to be in Christchurch,
Yeah.
Canterbury Harbour at the time, and it was in Gisborne, you know.
Yeah.
As quick as it took to steam. We used our helicopters during Kokoda, all those things. So it's not taking away from what other people are doing, it's adding on, but also lending our voice and our advocacy.
So we'll certainly ask for the wording in regards to whatever will be supporting that.
Sounds good. In terms of undeclared emergencies, in the early stages of events, there's coordination occurring. So before declaration, there's a bit of lack of clarity around expectations of authority and the protections liability during that phase. So clear guidance would be of assistance, national consistency and volunteer protection, and also just around the health and safety requirements around tasking during state of emergency as to who's the PCBU and whose responsibility is it for injuries and those sort of components. If it's during response time, there's a coordinated response and making sure that there's the governance and the decision makers are all safe in that space as things go on.
Yeah, it's a difficult space, though, Marcus, isn't it? If you go back to Whitehall, the minister actually okayed the helicopters to go and pick up people which they weren't even going to get off the ground because of health and safety.
I think it's affected the response at Moel too. Particularly some agencies that have had experience of losing people in response have become a little bit risk averse. The organisations have, and so we need to be mindful that this is going to be an ongoing conversation, because you get pushback from the community. Why can't they go in? And yet the employers have a role and a responsibility to protect their staff. So there's a balance between community expectation and then what people know is a safe way to respond. And I don't know how we get that message out.
Have you had any discussions with WorkSafe at all?
I haven't, because it's not my role, but
No,
I
but I mean,
imagine our organisation has.
Yeah, and I guess it's part of the submission is like just trying to flag that and saying, we need to make sure that we keep people safe. Don't get me wrong, we don't need to be it's putting people in danger, but we need to make sure that we've got the right mechanisms in place so that the chief executives or controllers or people don't end up in jail through the process of we just need to make the right mechanisms in place so that there's safety occurring, but no one's going to get sent off to jail or whatever process is going.
Yeah, look, I understand that from a purely, but again, go back to the Christchurch earthquake. So Federated Farmers and the student army went in at a time when the bureaucrats were spinning. They didn't know what to do. They had no plans around earthquakes. Nothing was happening. And went in and started clearing up areas where we found people that were in the state and needed help. So you have somewhere in there you have to have something about that, because actually it's very easy to do nothing. But and it actually leads to a really bad outcome. So you got to weigh that stuff up, and I understand what you're saying. I'm just putting a different view, practically looking at events, and actually doing nothing in some instances isn't the right thing. You do need to be careful, but you need to work on something.
Lyndall, Phil and Roger.
Yeah, I think Moa is a really good example of the early stage events part of the conversation, because given the misinformation, and I haven't tested any of it, but if there were reports of slips and nobody knew, there was a bit of passing of who's responsible to go and check it or whatever, however that turns out, that's a really good learning opportunity, so that those early stage signs have a clear pathway for checking and coordination pre-declaration. So you've got a real life example, sadly.
My response would be to your question is yes, if we can generate greater clarity, because the other situation is when there's a slower onset emergency, For instance, flooding coming down a catchment. And my intuition suggests that that might trigger a declaration at a local level, like Gore. A few hours later, it actually might be a risk for someone else. But if we've taken a more coordinated, integrated approach to monitoring and considering the risks and acting a little earlier so that we don't miss opportunity to gather information, act and mobilise potential resources, we could miss the boat to save money, save lives, save property. So the greater clarity, the better in my mind around that early stage and slower onset emergency.
The one thing I might suggest, Marcus, in this instance, is that you talk to EMS now about early reports from places that did go quite early with localised states of emergency this time to see whether that actually helped. Moa is not the example, but Northern or Tairāwhiti might be, just so that we can see, because they are aware and we're all learning from all of this, whether there's something that we can put in that says, for example, this worked, because we've got a couple of recent events to be able to look at as a, I know we haven't had full reports or debriefs on it, but it might be helpful to find out if they know anything early now, how that might have worked.
Roger.
Thanks, Phil said it.
Okay. Sounds good.
Last part was implementation resourcing requirements. So stronger expectations will require clear national guidance. Regional council, EU partners, community response groups will need support to meet new responsibilities. Effective implementation depends on adequate resourcing to avoid inconsistent delivery across the region. So basically, saying the implementation of changes need to be adequately resourced for this process too. So administration for that. Real quick, rates capping. Can I just pause on that last slide, the previous one?
Oh, yes.
Another way to articulate it is that there's a authority funding misalignment.
Yes.
Asking more of us, but not resourcing us to do it. So in a rates cap environment, how do councils respond to that obligation?
And also just looking at the act that we're not talking about today, but which is the local reorganisation part, is that what we are depending on down here is the 4 entities working together and making more, getting more value out of the money that our citizens are putting into emergency management. We don't know what those changes are going to affect. So this is another case where a potential piece of legislation may undermine this act.
Is it clearly around liability, Marcus, in terms of the Cs, given the space, noting we've got a slightly different model here?
Yeah, and that's sort of something we're going to get clarity on, make sure that it's in our submission, that there is real good clarity of exactly how that works with liability of the chief executives from that health and safety perspective.
It's broader than health and safety. There's a criminal element in this as well, I understand. And not that I'm pushing back on that, but just in terms of there are some issues around.
Yes, it's fair.
We'll make sure that we're covered.
Is that a PCBU?
No, it's not health and safety. It's broader than health and safety. So there's an issue under this legislation. So yes, I haven't been able to get a clear answer on this. So it'd be interesting to see what's happening around the country and what GUK is saying on this as well.
Yeah, I'll look into that one. For rates capping, pretty well known. Hopefully, council's got a bit of an understanding. There's a bit of a summary slide. So basically, effectively improve ratepayer affordability and constrain rapid rates growth and encourage councils to live within their means. Basically, looking to reduce increases of rates to between 2% and 4% per year, with a maximum cap of 4%. And the cap would apply to general rates, targeted rates, uniform annual general charges, and water charges and water fees would be excluded from the rates capping process, in the sense that that infrastructure and the delivery of those services and the investment needed in those spaces cannot operate with a rates capping because the investment is way too much. Effectively, councils would need to seek an exemption to increase the cap, and there's only really exceptional circumstances when that would be able to apply. such as natural disasters or major infrastructure growth. So there's a conversation today about Kanoa funding, some of those elements around how do we make sure that we can continue investing and maintaining existing assets into the future and not borrowing too much money, because then you won't be able to repay your debt from the rates you're gaining. So how do you manage that fiscal responsibility within the envelope for existing assets and capital expenditure to deal with future problems that may show up with climate change and other aspects? So effectively expecting legislation in 2026 with caps taking effect from 2027, which is our LTP year. So we sort of started the conversation near on 3 hours ago, basically saying we're changing what we're doing, how we're doing it, who's doing it, what it looks like, and how we're paying for it. So some of these big decisions that are coming up are all going to need to land in the LTP.
Just quickly, major infrastructure, major infrastructure is flood protection in Southland, and it's still a major for whatever entity is looking in the future. Would that class? Would that no?
So that's part of our submission, is effectively putting that on the radar, saying it's infrastructure that needs to be excluded from a rates cap because it's providing natural hazard relief.
And there is the connection with the emergency management inclusion of the flood banks as infrastructure.
So the rates cap is not effective.
Partially.
Yeah, but you can move money from.
Means you can't do all the fluffy things then.
Yeah, and it becomes prioritisation. If there's a whole lot of new legislative mandates coming out, that's going to require costs. We're operating on a legislative requirements only, and that's where the money's going. The discretionary stuff that is nice to have, and the things that
actually matter
don't fall off the bottom of the ledger.
I would say this is more than just live within your means. It's live within your means and focus on core services. So the prioritisation is inherent in the driver for this proposal.
And it's probably run down assets a little bit as well, because you can't fund depreciation and renewals and upgrades and all those aspects.
So Councillor Rose, you're not going to get your flood bank anytime soon.
This is a bit of a graph from the current LTP. So we're in the middle of that, those three green bars at the moment. So we said 12.9% last year, but we dropped the rates through the annual plan process to 8.8. So effectively next year we're looking at 12.6 in the LTP for a rates rise, and then over time dropping down. So I just thought I'd give you a bit of this graphic of where the last few years have been and what the LTP is saying we're heading for in the future. It's interesting to note sort of 5 years are hovering around that 4% mark. 4.5, 3.9 and 4.3. And so we're not miles away, but effectively when that gets recast with the LTP, then all that work program and projects get reassessed into a new framework. So potential ES positions, support of the intent to provide greater clarity and transparency and reduce rates burden on households. So worthy cause, but effectively more clarity is needed about how the capping formula will be applied to Environment Southland. And we recommend that the consideration around inflationary measures around the actual costs to local government as opposed to the CPI indexes. We recommend Environment Southland uses some more detailed modelling, or we recommend that Environment Southland be part of a test case with the new rates capping models applied, so that we can understand the actual implications of how this would actually shake out given our rural population, low growth, and then the rural economy, because we're a little bit different than everyone else. And also looking, and Haley and I have had conversations too, looking at the local government arrangement proposal at the moment with a rural unitary and a city unitary. You look at the asset division between the roads and the infrastructure for 3 waters across all the townships in the Southland District and Gore District areas, the flood banks. There's a lot of assets that are going to need a lot of investment in the future, whereas you look at the city council boundaries, the amount of assets is completely different, and then the value of who benefits from the flood infrastructure within the region. Ultimately the city is going to benefit from some of those impacts as well. So trying to understand the implications of rates capping and mandates and regional governance rearrangements and legislative requirements about regional spatial planning, how will those shake out are all factors that need to be considered, so.
Can
A
I
lot
just
of
make,
cost sitting in the rural areas without the rate cutters necessarily, and vice versa in the urban area.
we're not putting, in regards, we're looking at the 2 unitary model. I'll just be very careful with where
Yes.
I know you understand and talking about the assets.
Yeah.
And put anything out in regards to saying, oh, this is what a 2 unitary looks like. It's almost giving, what's the word, fuel?
Credence.
Yeah.
Yeah, to the 2 unitary. I'm just being very careful that we have an open mind about the future of local government and South, and so everything's all shapes and sizes will be on the table and discussed. So I'm just very wary of commentary and papers and things, and if it looks like, I mean, I understand why you're doing it, but it's how someone might perceive.
That reference.
Yeah, the wording of it. That's all, you know, just suggestions.
The next positions, capping may weaken implementation of environment, health and statutory mandates, flood infrastructure, hazard management and resource management system rollout. Levels of service within the community are likely to drop, so that the things the community are actually asking us to do that are discretionary, that would probably fall off the bottom of the list. Include measures within the proposal to specifically account for biosecurity eradication programs and pest incursions. Effectively, biosecurity is not on the list for higher increases. Effectively, any biosecurity issues like Undaria or wilding pines, effectively that needs to be covered within the 4% increases. Yep. All those aspects would have to be within that fiscal envelope of 4%. Ensure natural hazard infrastructure, river management's rates, for example, are exempt from, similar to the Three Waters infrastructure, which we sort of just talked about, and ensuring climate change impacts on existing infrastructure are considered. So when you're thinking about those aggregating factors over time, and if you're looking to top up banks or put a new pump station down Stead Street or something similar, then how do we manage the funding of those aspects, considering the climate change impacts that are going to be coming in?
Eric and Phil.
Yeah, in terms of the capping, one can understand the government's really grumpy about cost of living and rates are a big one that's there. But given the complexities and the uniqueness of South, and I just wonder if there isn't a case that can be made that operational work be capped, but there be a provision when infrastructural investment is required, that there is a provision to make a case if the government's controlling this for those things, because they don't come under an operational year-by-year thing. They have a long-term benefit. And I just think there needs to be some separation there between infrastructural investment and operations, if that makes sense.
I'm going to offer a slightly different perspective here. Again, it's not that I don't disagree with it, it's just that I think climate change impacts on existing infrastructure is important, but I think you need to expand it to existing to communities as well, because it may not be an infrastructure solution or remediation that is demanded as we consider managed retreat. Managed is superfluous in my mind. Retreat is always managed, but it's route.
Same thing.
So I think that's an important issue in terms of climate change could play a bunch of different ways, and that's going to impose obligations on us. Again, the issue they're attending to arguably is a misdiagnosis, and the regulatory impact statement, it was interesting that the quality assurance statement was considered unsatisfactory. It didn't meet the quality assurance criteria, and that's interesting to read that in the RIS, that actually what they're proposing here, they think this is the problem, this is the solution. It doesn't seem to marry up based on the impact statement. And I'm wondering if even flagging that issue undermines our confidence in what's being proposed is something that's worth flagging in our submission. By pointing out the deficiencies in their own homework, if they're asking us to be accountable for what we do, it seems to me that we should be willing to call them out as well on that particular approach.
It seems to be a bit of a common theme across regulatory impact statements.
At least they had one. At least they had one on this occasion.
I think also, Mr. Chair, the other factor that they are not factoring in, whether deliberately or just for lack of thinking about it, is that a lot of the costs that have faced TAs and regional authorities over the last 10 years have been central government imposed as well. And so you cannot cap against those. Where do you find the money to respond to stuff that they tell us we must do? And I think that applies, you know, to a greater or lesser extent to TAs and regional authorities. It's not going to go away, because in actual fact, the bill that we just talked about prior to this, you know, emergency management response, that comes back on this community as well. There's no central funding for the day-to-day business as usual. But the requirements to do extra things is going to impose a cost on our ratepayers, on our citizens, come out of your tax, your rates take. So when they say capping, what does it include and exclude? And particularly when it comes down to overheads and staffing, because if they tell us we have to have staff to do certain things, but we cannot go to rates to fund those positions, where do we go? And if they're not prepared to put their hands in their pockets to do it, then how does it happen? Because the cost burden to a pensioner or to a struggling business or to a resentful farmer, because I'm sure there is one, is not going to change. You know, they're not going to see it as central government costing them this money. They're going to see it as you not being efficient at your job, should you still have a job by the time all this happens. But, you know, it's very fair that you say this, because I don't think this actually occurs to some people who don't have to go cap in hand for the funding for their job or their, you know, it disappears into a great big pool of money, whereas the pools of money that you're talking about to do all this is very limited, and the people who are going to pay for it are not the 5 million of the country, they're the 100,000 that live within our boundary, and their limitations are different. So I really do urge you to, if you can find a way to say that, that things that are directed down from central government under this rate capping thing may have to come with funding, or it won't be possible to do them.
Can I just also add, Marcus, there's a transition of the two systems we were talking about earlier, when the old RMA system's running out, the new one's being implemented. Sometimes those transitions incur additional costs.
Yes, they do.
They use more resources to get through the transition, to get safely at the other side. And so that seems to be kind of happening while this rates capping is being imposed on us, which means you may not implement the new system as effectively as you might otherwise. That could compromise that.
Marcus and Haley, I don't like this at all. But if they're going to keep pushing stuff down at us, then we've got to keep paying. It might only be you and I here. You get what I mean?
Definitely not me.
Well,
I've
you
got a
know,
mortgage to pay.
yeah, but I don't. That's the logical end of what they're trying to do. So, I know, well, if it's me, it's not worth much. If you guys, it's worth a lot. Something more, hell of a lot more.
Yeah, I guess it's that mandate that's coming down the pipeline that we have to do some things, and not having the sufficient tools or mechanisms to be able to deliver on those things.
We'll do it ourselves then.
Last slide, then I'll leave it to it. Effectively, oops, I went backwards. So what we want is provide clear exemptions and methodology for gaining approval for higher rates. So if we do need to go cap in hand, as Councillor Royce asked, then there's an easy process to get through. And then support the measures to ensure that councils are prioritising their work to meet their obligations that support additional benchmarking measures. So effectively, if they're talking about putting more benchmarking measures in to get more clarity and visibility, that they include a measure such as how many FTEs per head of population served, and then in that sort of metric environment, Southland would look kind of better than some regions as well. So you look at the functions are the same between us and Canterbury, and the areas are the same, the size of the population is completely different, the size of the resource doing the work and delivering the functions that are legally required. Are proportionate to the size of the population. So FTE per head per population is probably a good measure that you should look at as well as just spending and rates rising.
I would also add in, actually, I mean, to cut across here, a companion measure around square kilometre served as well, to factor in the fact we've got a lot of land and not very many people, and some of those functions, coastline in particular, and some of those functions are about the area, and some of the functions are about the people and businesses and things we do. So that's just my off the cuff suggestion, I guess.
The other little fun fact is we're at the top of the tree regionally on income. It used to be below Taranaki, but now we're above Taranaki, so we're the highest rural area in the country. So economically, so we more than pay our way in taxation.
Thanks very much for your time.
Phil.
I'm just going to observe really broadly, zooming out, all of this discussion today and returning to that very first sentiment about do we remain kind of neutral and passive as we respond to this. I think it's appropriate that someone has to call out dumb ideas, because that's what we're seeing with this, all of this happening at once. What emerges is it might be well-intentioned in a specific silo, but when you stack them all up, it looks really dumb from a regional perspective. Someone has to call out and alert government. If they're not deliberately doing it, let's give them the benefit of the doubt that it's not deliberate, that it's well-intentioned but naive. Alert them to that. If it is deliberate, well, I mean, what are we going to do about that?
Use some emojis.
Look, I think the government's responding to a whole lot of lobbyists who are saying regional councils have a handbrake on us making the economy grow like we want it to grow. And we're not the problem, it's the rules that we've got to operate under by order in council and regulation and statutes that are in place. It's not us. That's my view.
We've got to administer.
With that erudite piece of information.
Just quickly, Jim,
Well done.
if you've got it.
Just suggest to Councillor Roy that that new RMA framework not address some of that though.
Well, let's hope so, yes.
I think
the detail.
But well, why don't we beat that in and see how it works? Instead of blaming us.
Very good, thank you.
Right, thank you.
Harris. And yeah.
We could offer,
Pie woman.
we could offer to be a
Marcus.
Oh, 11.